The air beneath the heavy sun-bleached silk canopies is thick with the scent of roasted cumin, aged leather, and the sweet, heavy musk of ambergris. Shafts of brilliant, golden light pierce through the gaps in the canvas, illuminating a chaotic dance of dust motes above a sea of trading floor activity. Here, in the heart of a bustling desert bazaar, the clatter of Roman denarii mingles with the rustle of Han Dynasty silk and the low rhythmic grumble of resting camels. You are standing at the crossroads of the world, a place where gold is weighed in scales and secrets are the most valuable currency of all. We have been told that the Silk Road was a simple network of trade routes, a primitive bridge between the East and West that began with the Han Dynasty around 130 BC. History books paint it as a slow, arduous progression of merchants carrying spices and fabric across a wasteland. But that version of history is incomplete. The evidence now suggests that the Silk Road was not a beginning but a recovery, a desperate attempt to reconnect a global civilization that had been shattered long before the first Roman legion was ever formed. The smoking gun lies buried in the shifting sands of the Tarim Basin, where DNA-attested mummies with European features and plaid textiles dating back to 2000 BC proved that a high-tech transcontinental exchange existed to millennia before the textbooks claim. Tonight we will peel back the layers of sand and time. We will move from the opulent courts of Chang'an to the hidden mountain fortresses of the Assassins, uncovering a hidden timeline of lost technologies and forgotten empires that once held the world in a unified grip. The dust never settles in the Taklamakan desert. It hangs in the air like a living curtain, turning the horizon into a pale ghost of itself. The name itself means place of no return in the old Uyghur tongue, and for good reason. This is a sea of sand that stretches for over 1,000 miles, a blank void on the map where temperatures swing from scorching daylight heat to bone-cracking cold once the sun disappears. The sand here is not golden. It is gray, ash-colored, ancient, and yet, through this wasteland, a thread of humanity was stretched across 4,000 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The official story begins in 130 BC, when the Han Emperor Wu sent an envoy named Zhang Qian westward on a desperate diplomatic mission. Zhang Qian was tasked with forging an alliance with a nomadic tribe called the Yusi to counter the growing threat of the Xiongnu, the steppe warriors who had terrorized the northern borders of China for generations. Zhang Qian failed in his mission. He was captured, imprisoned for over a decade. But when he finally returned to the Han court, he brought something far more valuable than a military alliance. He brought maps, reports of kingdoms no Chinese scholar had ever heard of, cities made of baked brick and gold, wine that came from grapes, not rice, horses so powerful they were said to sweat blood. Zhang Qian described a world that existed beyond the western mountains, a world that was rich, organized, and connected by a web of roots that had been there long before he ever set foot on them. And that is the first crack in the official story. Because Zhang Qian did not discover the Silk Road. He reported it. The infrastructure he described, the oasis cities, the caravanserais, the irrigation channels carved into the desert rock, these were not new constructions. They were already there, waiting, as if someone had walked this path long before and left behind the bones of a forgotten network. The Pamir Mountains rise like a wall of stone and ice at the western edge of the Taklamakan. The locals call them the roof of the world, and the name is not an exaggeration. Peaks here climb above 24,000 feet, and the passes between them are so narrow that a caravan can only move in single file. The air is thin, the wind is brutal, and the cold can kill a man in his sleep if he does not keep a fire burning through the night. This is where the Silk Road began, its ascent into the unknown. And yet, archaeological evidence shows that traders were crossing these mountains as early as 2000 BC. Pottery shards, bronze tools, lapis lazuli from the mines of Afghanistan, found in burial sites in China that predate the Han Dynasty by over a millennium. The question is not whether trade existed before Zhongqian. The question is how it was possible at such a scale, with such precision, without any of the organizational infrastructure that modern historians claim was necessary. The answer may lie in something far older than Rome or China. This touches on a deeper mystery about pre-glacial civilizations that I am currently declassifying for the next part of this series. The evidence is dangerous, so you need to be subscribed to see it when it drops. But back in the desert, the dust continues to fall. In the year 1978, a Soviet archaeological team working in northern Afghanistan uncovered something that should not have existed: 6 burial mounds near a site called Tilya Tepe, the Hill of Gold. When they opened the tombs, they found over 20,000 pieces of gold crowns, daggers, necklaces, belt buckles inlaid with turquoise and carnelian. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Roman coins were mixed with Chinese mirrors. Greek iconography sat beside Indian deities. It was a fusion of styles that suggested not just trade, but deep cultural exchange. The tombs were dated to the 1st century AD, right at the height of the Silk Road's golden age. But the objects inside told a different story. Some of the gold work bore symbols that matched Scythian designs from 500 years earlier. Others carried motifs that would not appear in Roman art for another 2 centuries. It was as if time had folded in on itself, and all the great empires of the ancient world had gathered in one place to bury their dead. The Bactrian gold, as it came to be known, was proof of something the textbooks rarely admit. The Silk Road was not a slow evolution. It was an explosion of connectivity that appeared almost overnight, as if a switch had been flipped. And the entire ancient world suddenly remembered how to talk to itself, and the physical toll of maintaining this network was staggering. A merchant caravan leaving the city of Chang'an in eastern China would need to travel for 6 months just to reach the markets of Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. 6 months of walking through landscapes that shifted from lush river valleys to salt flats to mountain passes where the snow never melted. The camels carried silk, tea, porcelain, and paper. The return journey brought glassware, wool, gold, and wine. But the real cargo was something intangible: information. Every merchant who survived the crossing became a living library. They carried knowledge of distant courts, of new gods, of technologies that had never been seen in their home cities. A glassblower from Syria could teach his craft to a workshop in Lu. A Buddhist monk from India could translate scriptures in the caves of Dunhuang. The Silk Road was not just a trade route, it was a neural network, connecting the minds of the ancient world in a way that would not be seen again until the invention of the printing press. But the cost was brutal. The Taklamakan Desert alone claimed thousands of lives. Entire caravans vanished without a trace, swallowed by sandstorms or lost to dehydration when a well ran dry. The skeletons of camels and men still surface in the dunes, their bones bleached white by the sun, half buried in the ash-colored sand. Archaeologists working in the region have uncovered cairn stone markers placed every few miles along the ancient routes, each one a memorial to someone who did not make it. And yet, despite the danger, despite the cost, the caravans kept moving. Why? The answer lies in the nature of the goods themselves. Silk, at the height of the Roman Empire, was worth its weight in gold. Literally, a single bolt of Chinese silk could buy a small villa in the countryside, outside Rome. The demand was insatiable. Roman senators draped themselves in it. Empresses commissioned gowns so fine they were nearly transparent. The historian Pliny the Elder complained that Rome was bleeding gold to the east, hemorrhaging wealth in exchange for fabric. But silk was more than just a luxury. It was a geopolitical weapon. The Chinese guarded the secret of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, with ruthless efficiency. Any attempt to smuggle silkworm eggs out of China was punishable by death. The Han Dynasty understood that their monopoly on silk production was the foundation of their economic dominance, and they protected it the way modern nations protect nuclear codes. The Silk Road was not just a path for merchants. It was a lifeline that tied the fate of empires to the survival of a single insect. And then there were the oasis cities, scattered along the desert routes like pearls on a string. These cities were the true lifeline of the Silk Road: Kashgar, Khotan, Turpan. Each one was a fortress of civilization in the middle of nowhere, sustained by underground irrigation systems called khares that channeled snowmelt from distant mountains through a network of tunnels and wells. The engineering required to build these systems was staggering. Some of the khares extended for dozens of miles beneath the desert surface, maintaining a steady flow of water even in the height of summer. But here is the strange part. The khares systems found in western China are nearly identical in design to the qanats of Persia, which are themselves identical to the fougera systems of North Africa. Same angle of descent, same tunnel width, same maintenance shafts placed at regular intervals. It is as if someone had designed a single blueprint and distributed it across 3 continents, long before any of these regions had contact with each other, according to the standard historical timeline. The city of Dunhuang sits at the edge of the Gobi Desert, where the northern and southern routes of the Silk Road converged before continuing west. It is a place of extremes: scorching summers, freezing winters, and yet, for over 1,000 years, it thrived as one of the most important cultural hubs in Central Asia. The Magao Caves, just outside the city, contain over 700 Buddhist shrines carved into the cliffside, their interiors covered in murals that depict scenes from across the known world. Greek gods stand beside Chinese dragons. Persian merchants trade with Indian monks. The walls of these caves are a visual record of a world that was far more connected than we have been led to believe. And then, suddenly, it all stopped. By the 15th century, the overland Silk Road had collapsed. The oasis cities were abandoned. The trade routes fell silent. The great caravanserais, those fortress-like inns where merchants once rested, crumbled into ruins, their walls reclaimed by the desert. For centuries, the Silk Road existed only as a memory, a legend whispered in the bazaars of Istanbul and the tea-houses of Beijing. But the infrastructure remained. Beneath the sand, the khares tunnels still carried water. The cairns still marked the paths. The bones of the road were still there, waiting, as if the whole network had simply gone dormant, waiting for someone to wake it up again. And that is exactly what is happening now. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched by China in 2013, is the largest infrastructure project in human history. Over $1 trillion invested in roads, railways, and ports that trace almost the exact same routes as the ancient Silk Road. The Chinese government does not call it a revival. They call it a continuation, as if the road never truly died, as if it was always meant to return. But before we can understand where the Silk Road is going, we need to understand where it truly came from, and that means going back further than 130 BC. Back to a time when the desert was not a desert, and the mountains were not yet frozen. Back to the mummies with red hair and plaid clothing, buried in the sand 2,000 years before the Han Dynasty ever existed. The foundation has been laid. The scale has been established. But the story is just beginning. And the next chapter will shatter everything you thought you knew. But in the heart of the Tarim Basin, beneath layers of salt and sand, something impossible was waiting to be found. The year was 1978. A team of Chinese archaeologists was surveying the edge of the Lop Nur salt flats, a region so desolate that even the nomadic herders avoided it. The ground here is not sand. It is crystallized salt, hard as concrete, stretching for miles in every direction like a frozen white sea. Nothing grows, nothing lives. The air is so dry it pulls moisture from your lungs with every breath. And yet, they found her. A woman, perfectly preserved. Her skin was still intact, leathered by the salt, but recognizable. Her hair was long, braided, and a deep auburn red. Her face was narrow, with a high nose bridge and pronounced cheekbones. She wore a conical felt hat, a woolen dress, and leather boots. And draped across her shoulders was a cloak made of plaid twill fabric, the pattern woven in shades of brown and cream. She looked European. But she was buried in the heart of China, nearly 2,000 miles from the nearest European settlement. And the radiocarbon dating of the organic material in her tomb came back with a result that made no sense. 1800 BC, 3,800 years ago. A full 17 centuries before the Silk Road was supposed to have opened. They called her the Beauty of Lu, and she was not alone. Over the next 3 decades, archaeologists working in the Tarim Basin uncovered over 200 similar burials, men, women, and children, all with the same physical features: tall, Caucasian, red, blonde, or light brown hair, buried in felt clothing and woven textiles that matched patterns found in Bronze Age Europe. Some of the bodies were so well preserved by the desert conditions that their eyelashes were still visible, their fingernails intact, the tattoos on their skin still readable. But the real shock came from the DNA testing. In 2009, a team of geneticists extracted mitochondrial DNA from the remains of the Tarim mummies and ran a full haplogroup analysis. The results were published in the journal BMC Biology, and they were unequivocal. The maternal lineage of these individuals belonged to haplogroup H, a genetic marker common in modern Europeans but virtually absent in East Asia. The paternal lineage showed an even more striking pattern: haplogroup R1A1, a genetic signature that traces back to the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, where the Proto-Indo-European peoples are believed to have originated. These were not migrants from the Han Dynasty era. They were not early traders. They were settlers. And they had been living in the Tarim Basin for over 1,000 years before the first Chinese dynasty was even formed. The textbooks had no explanation for this. Mainstream archaeology maintains that the Silk Road was the first sustained contact between East and West, that before the Han Dynasty, the civilizations of Europe and China existed in isolation. separated by mountains and deserts that were simply too vast to cross. But the mummies prove otherwise. They prove that a population of European origin had not only crossed those mountains and deserts but had established permanent settlements in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. And they had done it with technology that should not have existed yet. The plaid twill fabric found on the beauty of Lulen is not simple weaving. Twill requires a diagonal pattern created by passing the weft thread over one or more warp threads, and then under two or more loop, creating a texture that is both strong and flexible. It is a technique that appears in Europe around 2000 BC, roughly the same time as the Tarim burials. But the presence of this technique in Western China, at the same time, suggests something far more significant than independent invention. It suggests a shared tradition, a common cultural origin, a connection that predates the written record. The graves themselves offer more clues. The burial site at Kriegel, one of the oldest in the Tarim Basin, contains over 40 mummies arranged in concentric circles around a central wooden post. The post is carved with spirals and geometric patterns that match symbols found in the megalithic tombs of Ireland and the standing stones of Brittany. The bodies are wrapped in woolen shrouds and placed in wooden coffins shaped like boats, a burial custom that appears in Scandinavia during the same period. But the most disturbing detail is the orientation. Every single body is positioned with the head facing east, toward the rising sun, toward the distant mountains, toward something that no longer exists on any map. The Chinese government, for decades, was reluctant to acknowledge the full implications of the Tarim mummies. Official publications referred to them as early settlers or ancient peoples, avoiding any reference to their European features or genetic origins. The reason for this reluctance is political. The Tarim Basin is located in Xinjiang, a region with a long history of ethnic tension between the Han Chinese majority and the Uyghur Muslim population. The discovery of Caucasian mummies predating both groups complicates the narrative of who has the rightful claim to the land. But the evidence does not care about politics. In 2007, the Chinese government allowed the mummies to be displayed publicly for the first time at the Xinjiang Museum in Urumqi. The exhibit drew massive crowds. Tourists from Europe stood in front of the glass cases, staring at faces that looked like their own ancestors, buried on the other side of the world. The Chinese visitors were equally fascinated, not because the mummies looked foreign, but because they did not. Many of the Uyghur people in the region have light eyes and hair, features that now seemed to echo an ancient connection to the West. And then the exhibit was quietly closed. The official reason given was renovation, but the mummies were never put back on display. They remain in storage, accessible only to approved researchers, their presence a quiet reminder that history is not always what we are told. But the forensic evidence continues to accumulate. In 2010, a separate team working in the western edge of the Tarim Basin uncovered a burial site that pushed the timeline back even further. The site, known as Shaowei, contained over 300 graves arranged in a massive spiral pattern, each marked with tall wooden posts shaped like oars. The posts were painted with red ochre and topped with leather balls stuffed with wool. From a distance, the site looked like a forest of silent sentinels, standing watch over the dead. The bodies here were older than the beauty of Lulen. Some dated back to 2000 BC, and the preservation was extraordinary. The dry air and salt content of the soil had mummified the remains naturally, without any embalming process. Skin, hair, clothing, Even the wooden coffins were intact, carved from poplar trees that once grew along rivers that no longer exist. But it was the contents of the graves that raised the most questions. Each body was buried with a small collection of personal items: leather pouches, stone tools, wooden combs, and grain. Specifically wheat. Not rice, not millet, wheat. A crop that originated in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East and spread westward into Europe during the Neolithic period. The presence of wheat in the Tarim Basin at this early date suggests that these people were not just travelers, they were farmers. They had brought their crops with them, along with their animals, their tools, and their gods. And the genetics confirm it. Further DNA analysis of the Shoei mummies revealed something even more startling. The individuals buried there showed genetic markers that linked them not just to the Pontic steppe, but to the Afanasivo culture, a Bronze Age people who lived in southern Siberia around 3000 BC. The Afanasivo are believed to be the first speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language, the linguistic ancestor of nearly every language spoken in Europe, Iran, and northern India today. This means the mummies in the Tarim Basin were not isolated migrants. They were part of a much larger movement of people, a migration that stretched from the grasslands of Eastern Europe to the deserts of Western China, covering over 4,000 miles. And they did it without horses, without wheeled vehicles, without any of the technologies that later civilizations would use to cross the same distance. How? The answer may lie in the climate. Between 3000 and 2000 BC, the Tarim Basin was not a desert. Paleoclimate data extracted from ice cores and sediment layers show that the region was significantly wetter during this period, with seasonal rivers fed by glacial melt from the surrounding mountains. The basin was dotted with lakes and marshlands, creating pockets of fertile land that could support agriculture and grazing. The same routes that would later become the Silk Road were, at that time, green corridors connecting oasis to oasis. But then something changed. Around 1700 BC, the climate shifted. The monsoon patterns that had brought moisture to Central Asia weakened. The rivers dried up. The lakes turned to salt flats, and the people who had lived there for over 1,000 years were forced to adapt or leave. Most left. The archaeological record shows a sudden depopulation of the Tarim Basin during this period, with many of the settlements abandoned and never reoccupied. But some stayed. The later mummies, dating from 1500 BC onward, show signs of cultural blending. The European features are still present, but the grave goods now include Chinese bronze mirrors, jade ornaments, and ceramic vessels that match styles from the Shang dynasty. The clothing remains woolen and plaid, but the weaving techniques show influence from silk production methods. These were not isolated tribes clinging to an ancient tradition. They were adapting, integrating, trading with the civilizations that were beginning to emerge to the east. And this is where the official Silk Road story begins to make sense. Zhang Qian, when he returned to the Han court in 126 BC, did not discover a new world. He rediscovered an old one. The routes he reported, the cities he described, the irrigation systems he marveled at, these were not recent constructions. They were the remnants of a network that had existed for over a millennium, built and maintained by people whose very existence has been erased from the historical record. The Tarim mummies are not an anomaly. They are evidence of a forgotten chapter. A chapter that shows the Silk Road was not a sudden invention of the Han dynasty, but the slow reactivation of pathways that had been walked by red-haired strangers long before the Great Wall was ever built. And if the textbooks are wrong about when the Silk Road began, what else are they wrong about? The beauty of Lulen lies in a climate-controlled vault now, her face hidden from public view, but her presence lingers, a silent testament to a time when the borders between East and West were not lines on a map but threads in a shared fabric woven by hands that carried the memory of a world we have only just begun to remember. The desert has a way of keeping secrets. The salt preserves what the sand would destroy, and beneath the white crust of the Tarim Basin, there are more bodies waiting, more graves, more evidence of a civilization that should not have been there, but it was. And it left behind more than just mummies. It left behind a question that echoes across 3,000 years. If these people could cross 4,000 miles of mountains and desert without horses or wheels, what were they running from? Or what were they running toward? The answer lies buried deeper still, in ruins that predate even the oldest mummies, in evidence that suggests the Silk Road was not just a recovery of lost trade routes, but a recovery of something far older. Something that existed before the ice came, before the floods, before the world we know was drowned beneath a rising sea. And that story begins with the city that should not exist. But 200 miles south of the mummy fields, buried beneath 15 feet of sand, there is a city frozen in time. The site is called Naya, and it should not exist. The first Western expedition to reach it was led by the Hungarian-British explorer Aurel Stein in 1906. He had been following rumors told by local shepherds of houses made of wood that occasionally surfaced after sandstorms in the depths of the Taklamakan. Stein was skeptical. The region was considered utterly lifeless. No water, no vegetation. No reason for anyone to have ever built anything there. But when he arrived, he found streets. Not ruins, streets. Wooden structures still standing, their walls intact. The beams still mortised together with Bronze Age joinery techniques. Rooms filled with furniture. Loom weights hanging from collapsed ceilings. Clay pots still sitting on shelves. And scattered across the floors. Thousands of wooden documents covered in a script that no one in Stein's expedition could read. It was as if the entire population had simply stood up one day and walked away, leaving everything behind. The city had been abandoned so quickly that meals were still sitting on tables, the food mummified by the dry air. Sandals were lined up by doorways. Children's toys lay in corners. And in the central plaza, a wooden post still stood, carved with symbols that matched nothing in the Chinese historical record. Stein called it the Pompeii of the Silk Road. But unlike Pompeii, there was no volcanic ash, no earthquake damage, no signs of fire or invasion. The city had not been destroyed. It had been deserted. And then, slowly, the desert had swallowed it whole, burying it so completely that it vanished from memory for over 1,000 years. The documents Stein recovered were written in Kharosthi, an ancient script used in the Gandhara region of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century AD. The language was Gandhari Prakrit, a dialect of Sanskrit. This was significant. Kharosthi was not a Chinese script. It was not even a Central Asian script. It was an Indian script, derived from Aramaic, which itself originated in the Near East. The presence of this script in the heart of the Taklamakan proved that Nia was not a Chinese outpost. It was a crossroads, a meeting point where languages, religions, and trade goods from India, Persia, and China converged. and the dates on the documents those that could be deciphered ranged from the 1st century AD to the 4th century AD, placing Nia's occupation squarely within the height of the Silk Road's golden age. But the city itself was older than the documents suggested. When archaeologists began excavating beneath the wooden structures, they found something that did not match the official timeline. Beneath the Carostiera buildings, there were older foundations, stone channels, irrigation systems carved into bedrock, and the techniques used to construct these channels were not Chinese. They were not Indian. They matched hydraulic engineering designs found in Mesopotamia, specifically in the ancient Sumerian city-states of Uruk and Ur, dating back to 4000 BC, the same angle of descent, the same width, the same method of lining the channels with fired clay to prevent seepage. But Sumer is 3,000 miles to the west, and 4000 BC is 2,000 years before the Tarim mummies were even buried. How could the same technology appear in two places separated by such vast distances and time? The standard explanation is independent invention, that human beings, when faced with the same problem how to bring water to a desert will, independently arrive at the same solution. But the math does not support this. The angle of descent in a functional irrigation canal is critical. Too steep, and the water erodes the channel. Too shallow, and sediment builds up and clogs the flow. The optimal angle is between 0.1 and 0.3 degrees. A margin of error so small that it requires precise surveying tools to achieve. The Sumerian engineers used a device called a groma, a wooden cross fitted with plumb lines, to measure this angle. And the same tool marks small circular depressions where the groma stakes were driven into the ground have been found at the Nia site. This is not independent invention. This is transmission. A direct transfer of knowledge from one culture to another, across a distance that should have been impassable. And then there is the wood. The structures at Naya were built almost entirely from poplar, a tree that requires significant water to grow. Modern surveys of the region show no evidence of poplar forests within 200 miles of the site. But pollen analysis from sediment cores taken near Nia reveals that between 2000 BC and 500 AD, the region was surrounded by dense stands of poplar and tamarisk, sustained by a network of rivers fed by glacial melt. This means Naya was not built in a desert. It was built in an oasis, a green corridor that existed for thousands of years before the water disappeared. But the water did not just dry up gradually. It stopped, abruptly. Sediment layers at the Naya site show a sharp transition around 400 AD. Below this layer, the soil is rich in organic material, pollen, plant fibers, insect remains. Above it, there is nothing, just sand. The transition is so sudden that it suggests a catastrophic change in the water supply, not a gradual climatic shift. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. In 2007, a team of climatologists drilling ice cores in the Gulia ice cap, a glacier in the Kunlun Mountains just north of the Tarim Basin, discovered something that changed the entire framework of human history in Central Asia. At a depth corresponding to approximately 12,800 years ago, they found a layer of sediment that should not have been there. The layer was thin, less than 2 centimeters, but it was packed with microscopic spherosteiny beads of melted rock and metal along with elevated concentrations of platinum, iridium, and nanodemonins. These are not naturally occurring in glacial ice. They are impact markers. The signature of something hitting the Earth's atmosphere with enough force to vaporize rock and scatter it across thousands of miles. The date matched perfectly with the onset of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt global cooling that lasted for nearly 1,300 years. Temperatures dropped. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. Sea levels fell, and across the northern hemisphere, megafauna began dying in massive numbers. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths. Species that had survived for millions of years went extinct within centuries. The theory, first proposed by physicist Richard Firestone and geologist Alan West, is that a fragment of a disintegrating comet struck the North American ice sheet, triggering a cascade of environmental catastrophes, wildfires, floods, a hemispheric-scale disruption of weather patterns. And the archaeological record shows something equally disturbing. The Clovis culture, the dominant human population in North America at the time, vanished almost overnight. Their distinctive stone tools disappear from the fossil record around 12,800 years ago and are never seen again. But the impact was not limited to North America. The platinum and iridium anomalies found in the Goulia ice cores match deposits found in sediment layers across Europe, the Middle East, and even South America. This suggests the object that struck Earth was not a single impactor, but a swarm of fragments, each one detonating in the atmosphere or slamming into the ice with the force of multiple nuclear warheads. And Central Asia was directly in the path. The Tarim Basin, at the time of the Younger Dryas event, was not a desert. Paleoclimate reconstructions show it was a temperate grassland, dotted with lakes and rivers, home to now extinct species of wild horses, camels, and rhinoceroses. But within a century of the impact, the pollen record changes. The grassland species vanish, the lake levels drop, and the region begins its slow transformation into the arid wasteland we see today. But here is the critical point. The infrastructure at Naya predates this transformation. The deepest irrigation channels at the site, the ones carved into bedrock using Mesopotamian techniques, show tool marks that have been dated using optically stimulated luminescence, a method that measures the last time quartz grains in the rock were exposed to sunlight. The results came back with a range between 10,000 and 8,000 BC, 4,000 years before Sumer, 6,000 years before the Tari mummies, 10,000 years before the Han dynasty. This means the Silk Road was not invented. It was inherited. The routes that Zhang Qian followed in 130 BC were not new trails blazed by Han explorers. They were old roads, reopened, paths that had been walked by people who lived before the ice came back, before the deserts formed, before the catastrophe that reset human civilization and forced the survivors to start over from nothing. And the evidence for this pre-catastrophe network is not limited to Nia. In 1998, archaeologists working at the Göbekli Tepe site in southeastern Turkey uncovered a massive stone complex dating to 9,600 BC. The site consists of over 20 circular enclosures, each one surrounded by T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons. Carved with intricate reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures. The level of sophistication required to quarry, transport, and erect these stones suggests an organized labor force numbering in the hundreds, supported by a stable food supply and a hierarchical social structure. But according to the standard model of human development, this should not have been possible. 9,600 BC is firmly within the Neolithic period, a time when humans were supposedly just beginning to experiment with agriculture. There were no cities, no writing, no monumental architecture. And yet, Göbekli Tepe exists, standing in defiance of the timeline, and the symbols carved into the pillars at Göbekli Tepe match symbols found at Naya. Specifically, a repeated motif of concentric circles bisected by a vertical line. At Göbekli Tepe, this symbol appears on multiple pillars, always positioned at eye level, always carved with the same proportions. At Naya, the same symbol appears on wooden posts, on ceramic vessels, and on bronze mirrors. The distance between the two sites is over 2,500 miles. The time gap is over 7,000 years, but the symbol is identical. This suggests something that mainstream archaeology is unwilling to accept, that the civilizations we call ancient Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Shang dynasty were not the first, they were the 7th or the 10th or the 20th. Iterations of a cycle that has repeated itself over and over, each time building on the ruins of what came before, each time forgetting a little more of what was lost. And the Silk Road is the scar tissue of that cycle. The paths it follows are not random. They trace the roots of rivers that no longer flow. They connect the sites of cities that were already ancient when Rome was founded. And they run along geological fault lines that suggest the landscape itself was shaped by forces far more violent than gradual erosion. The wooden documents recovered from Nia contain references to the old road and the way of the ancestors. They describe a network of way stations and supply depots that existed before the sand came, and in one fragmentary text, translated by the linguist Thomas Burrow in 1937, there is a line that has never been adequately explained. We walk the path of those who walked before the sky fell. The Younger Dryas impact did more than kill the megafauna. It erased the map. It buried the cities. It turned fertile plains into deserts and drowned coastal settlements beneath rising seas as the ice sheets melted in the aftermath. And the survivors, scattered across a ruined world, had to rediscover everything: language, agriculture, navigation, the knowledge of how to move water uphill. But they had a guide: the ruins, the roads, the channels carved into stone by hands that had held tools we no longer recognize. And they followed those ruins east, across the mountains, across the deserts, retracing the steps of a ghost civilization that had once spanned the world. Naya was not built by the people who left the Korosti documents. It was reoccupied by them. They moved into a city that was already there, repaired the irrigation channels that still worked, and lived in the shadow of a past they did not fully understand. And when the water finally stopped flowing in 400 AD, they left. Just as their predecessors had left 12,000 years earlier. When the sky fell and the world ended, the city remains, slowly sinking back into the sand, waiting for the next cycle to begin. And if history is any guide, that cycle is already underway. But while the ghost cities slept beneath the sand, a very different kind of ghost was marching east. The year was 53 BC. The Roman Republic was tearing itself apart. 3 men, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, had divided the known world between them in an unstable alliance that everyone knew would eventually collapse into civil war. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had bought his share of power with gold. But gold was not enough. He needed military glory, a triumph to match Caesar's conquest of Gaul, so he turned his eyes toward Parthia. The Parthian Empire controlled everything from the Euphrates River to the borders of India. They were wealthy beyond measure, enriched by their position as the middlemen of the Silk Road. spices from the east, silk from China, gold from the mines of Bactria. All of it flowed through Parthian hands before reaching Roman markets, and Crassus wanted it. He assembled an army of 42,000 men, 7 legions, 4,000 cavalry, and in the spring of 53 BC, he crossed the Euphrates and marched into the desert of northern Mesopotamia, confident that Roman discipline would crush the barbarian horse archers of the east. He was wrong. The Parthians met him at Kerhe, near the modern city of Harran, in southeastern Turkey. But they did not fight like Romans expected. They did not form battle lines. They did not charge. Instead, they circled. 10,000 mounted archers, wheeling around the Roman formations in a coordinated dance, loosing arrows in waves that never seemed to end. The Romans locked shields, formed the testudo, the tortoise formation that had broken every enemy they had ever faced. But the Parthian arrows were different. They were fired from composite bows with a pull weight of over 160 pounds, strong enough to punch through Roman armor at 200 yards, and the Parthians had an endless supply. Camel trains followed behind their cavalry, carrying nothing but arrows, thousands of them. The Roman lines held for hours. Then they began to crack. The heat was unbearable. The sun turned the metal armor into ovens. Men collapsed from heatstroke inside their shells of bronze and iron. Others, maddened by thirst, broke formation and ran toward a distant river that turned out to be a mirage. The Parthian cavalry cut them down in the open. By nightfall, 20,000 Romans were dead. 10,000 more were captured, and Crassus himself was executed in a humiliation ritual that became legend. According to the historian Plutarch, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, mocking his famous greed. But one unit survived. The first cohort of the 6th Legion, approximately 6,000 men, managed to break through the Parthian encirclement and flee east into the mountains. The official Roman records say they were lost, presumed dead. Their eagle standard never recovered. Their names struck from the rolls. But Chinese records tell a different story. In the year 36 BC, 17 years after Kerhe, a Han dynasty general named Chen Tang was laying siege to a fortified city in the Talas Valley, near the border of modern-day Kazakhstan. The city was controlled by a rogue Xiongnu chieftain named Gitzi, and Chen Tang had been sent to bring him to justice. But when the Han forces approached the city walls, they saw something that made no sense. The defenders were using a formation the Chinese had never seen before. A tight rectangle of infantry, shields locked, spears bristling outward. And they were using a defensive tactic that involved overlapping shields above their heads to protect against arrows raining from above. The testu. Chen Tang's official report, preserved in the Han Shu, the Book of Han, describes the enemy soldiers as having strange features and fighting in a manner unlike any steppe tribe. He noted their discipline, their refusal to break ranks even under sustained assault. And when the city finally fell, the survivors were taken prisoner and resettled in a newly founded garrison town in Gansu Province, western China. The town was called Liqian, and Liqian is the ancient Chinese phonetic rendering of legion. For centuries, this account was dismissed as myth, a curious coincidence. But in 2005, a team of geneticists from Lanzhou University conducted a DNA study of the modern inhabitants of Liqian, now called Jelisai. The results were published in the Journal of Human Genetics, and they were startling. 56% of the villagers tested positive for Caucasian genetic markers. Haplogroup R1b, common in Mediterranean populations. Physical features including green and blue eyes, prominent noses, and light brown hair, and a local oral tradition that claims their ancestors were Roman soldiers who came from the West. The evidence is circumstantial, but it is consistent. The timeline matches, the location matches, and the cultural remnants festivals involving mock gladiatorial combat, a preference for beef over pork, and an unusual tradition of bullfighting all point to a Roman origin. But if the first cohort did make it to China, how did they cross 3,000 miles of hostile territory without supplies, without maps, without any support from Rome? The answer lies in the Silk Road itself. By 53 BC, the trade routes between Rome and China were well established, maintained not by any single empire but by a network of independent city-states, nomadic tribes, and merchant guilds who profited from the flow of goods. A Roman soldier fleeing east would not have been walking through empty wilderness. He would have been following a beaten path, marked by caravanserais fortified in-spaced every 20 to 30 miles. Each one offered water, food, and shelter in exchange for coin or labor, and the Romans had both. The legions of the late Republic were paid in silver denarii, coins that were recognized and accepted across the ancient world. A single denarius could buy a week's worth of food in the markets of Samarkand or Kashgar, and skilled Roman engineersmen trained in road building, fortification, and siege warfare would have been valuable assets to any local ruler willing to offer protection in exchange for service. This is how empires bleed, not in a single catastrophic collapse, but in a slow hemorrhage of people, knowledge, and culture, leaking across borders and reappearing in places where they were never supposed to be. The journey from Carhae to the Talas Valley would have taken at least 2 years on foot. The first cohort would have moved through the Parthian highlands, skirting the edges of the empire that had destroyed them, avoiding major cities where Roman prisoners were worth their weight in gold. They would have traded their armor for wool cloaks, cut their hair, let their beards grow, anything to blend in with the caravans moving east, and they would have followed the water, the same irrigation channels that sustained Nia, the same hydraulic systems carved into bedrock by hands far older than Rome, guided them through the wasteland. Every oasis was a lifeline, every well a decision point. Turn north toward the steppe, or continue east toward the unknown. The survivors would have been the hardest men, not the officers with their silk-lined tents and personal slaves, but the rankers. The men who had marched from Gaul to Germania to Syria, who knew how to sleep in the mud and eat leather when rations ran out. Men who understood that the only law beyond the frontier was the law of survival. And when they reached the Talas Valley, they did what Roman soldiers always did. They built a fort. They took service with a local warlord, and they survived. But survival came at a price. By the time Chen Tang's army arrived, the Romans had been absorbed. They were no longer citizens of the Republic. They had no eagle to rally around, no senate to send reports to. They were ghosts, men without a country, fighting for a Jannu chieftain in a war that had nothing to do with Rome, and when the city fell, they were prisoners again. The resettlement at Lycian was not a reward, it was a strategic placement. The Han dynasty had a problem. The western frontier was constantly under threat from nomadic raids, and they needed loyal, disciplined soldiers to garrison the border forts, Roman legionaries, men who had survived Carhae and crossed the Silk Road on foot, were exactly the kind of troops the Han needed. So they were given land, wives, citizenship, and in return, they were expected to hold the line against the same steppe tribes that had once sheltered them. The archaeological evidence at modern Jelisai supports this. Excavations in the 1980s uncovered the remains of a fortified settlement with unusual architectural features. Rectangular barracks, defensive ditches arranged in a checkerboard pattern, and most tellingly, fragments of iron slag consistent with Roman smelting techniques, which differed significantly from Han metalworking methods. The iron produced by Roman forges had a higher carbon content, making it harder but more brittle. The Chinese preferred wrought iron, softer but more flexible. The presence of Roman-style iron at Lycian suggests the settlers were not just farmers. They were maintaining their craft, passing down their knowledge through generations. But knowledge is a fragile thing. It dies with the last person who remembers it. By the time of the Tang dynasty, around 700 AD, the oral traditions at Lycian had already begun to fade. The local chronicles describe the villagers as having strange customs but do not specify what those customs were. By the Song dynasty, 1,000 years after the first cohort's arrival, Lycian was just another farming village on the edge of the Gobi Desert. The stories of Rome had become myth. The names had been Sinicized, the bloodlines diluted, but the bones remember. In 2010, a second genetic study was conducted, this time using more advanced mitochondrial DNA sequencing. The results confirmed the earlier findings and added a crucial detail. The Caucasian genetic markers in Lycian were not distributed evenly across the population. They were concentrated in specific family lines, lineages that could be traced back through marriage records to a single founding generation in the 1st century BC. Is not the pattern you would see from random migration. It is the pattern of a closed military unit, intermarrying with local populations, but maintaining a distinct genetic core for several generations before finally blending into the broader Han population. And there is one more piece of evidence. A fragment of text. In 1931, the British archaeologist R.L. Stein, the same man who discovered Nia, was cataloging documents recovered from the Mogao caves near Dunhuang, when he came across a military roster dated to approximately 20 BC. The document was written in Chinese, but it contained a list of names that did not follow standard Han naming conventions. Names like Luusi, Kashi, Mahu. Stein, who had studied Latin, recognized these immediately. They were transliterations. Lucius, Cassius, Marcus, Roman Prena, written in Chinese characters because no one who recorded them knew what they actually meant. The document was catalogued and stored in the British Museum, where it sat untouched for decades. It was not until 2007, when a Latin scholar named Christopher Beckwith cross-referenced the names with surviving lists of Roman legionaries, that the connection was made. 3 of the names on the Dunhuang roster matched soldiers from the 6th Legion who were listed as missing, presumed dead after Carhae. The odds of this being a coincidence are astronomical. But even if we accept that Roman soldiers made it to China, what does this tell us about the Silk Road itself? It tells us that the road was not controlled by any single empire. It was a commons, a shared space that existed between empires, maintained by the economic self-interest of everyone who relied on it. The Parthians may have hated Rome, but they did not hunt down Roman deserters because those deserters had silver. The Jiannu may have been enemies of the Han, but they still traded with Han merchants because war does not stop the flow of silk. The Silk Road operated on a principle older than any nation: mutual benefit. And that principle was strong enough to carry 6,000 desperate men across 3,000 miles of desert and deliver them, battered but alive, into the arms of an empire that had never heard of Rome. But the Ghost Legion left more than genes behind. In the historical records of the Han Dynasty, there are references to Western military techniques being adopted by frontier garrisons in the 1st century BC. Specifically, the use of the shield wall and the coordinated javelin throw, tactics that were distinctly Roman and had no precedent in Chinese warfare. These techniques appear suddenly in the military manuals and then disappear just as quickly, absorbed into the broader evolution of Han military doctrine. This is how knowledge travels, not through grand declarations or official treaties, but through the quiet transfer of skills from teacher to student, from veteran to recruit, in dusty garrison towns at the edge of the world. And the road that carried those men east was the same road that carried silk west, the same road that carried Buddhism from India to China, the same road that carried the Black Death from the steppes to Europe. It was a conduit, not for goods alone, but for everything: ideas, diseases, gods, soldiers who had lost their empire but not their discipline. The first cohort of the 6th Legion marched into legend, but the road they walked was older than Rome, older than the Han, older than the memory of the cities that built it, and it is still there, waiting beneath the sand, waiting for the next lost cohort to follow it home. But long before any legion marched, long before silk was ever woven, there was a stone that moved across the world like a whisper of the divine, deep in the mountains of northeastern Afghanistan, in a valley so remote that even today it can only be reached on foot or by donkey. There is a mine that has been worked continuously for over 6,000 years. The mine is called Sarai Sang, and it produces a stone unlike any other on earth. Lapis lazuli, not blue like the sky, blue like the void between stars, a deep, saturated ultramarine shot through with veins of pyrite that glitter like flecks of gold suspended in an ocean of night. The ancients believed it was a piece of the heavens that had fallen to earth. The Sumerians called it the Stone of Stones. The Egyptians called it the flesh of the gods, and they would pay anything to possess it. The earliest evidence of lapis lazuli trade dates to 4000 BC, to millennia before the pyramids were built. Beads and amulets made from Afghan lapis have been found in Neolithic burial sites in Mehrgarh, in modern-day Pakistan, over 500 miles from the source. The stone was already moving, already valued, already part of a network that connected distant peoples who had no written language, no wheeled vehicles, and no domesticated horses. But the real mystery is not how far the stone traveled. It is how consistently it traveled. Between 3000 and 1000 BC, lapis lazuli from the Sarai Sang mine appears in every major civilization of the ancient world, in the royal tombs of yore, where Queen Pwabi was buried wearing a headdress studded with lapis beads. In the Indus Valley cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, where lapis seals were used to mark trade goods. In the palaces of Minoan Crete, where lapis inlays decorated ceremonial axes. And most famously, in Egypt, where the funeral mask of Tutankhamun was inlaid with lapis eyebrows, a symbol of divine authority. But here is the critical point. There is only one source. Lapis lazuli is not a common mineral. It forms only under very specific geological conditions, requiring the presence of limestone, pyrite, and extreme metamorphic heat. There are deposits in Chile, in Siberia, and in small pockets of Iran, but none of them match the quality or the chemical signature of the Afghan stone. And geochemical analysis, using trace element fingerprinting, has confirmed that nearly every piece of ancient lapis found in the Near East, the Mediterranean, and South Asia came from the same place, Khorasan. This means that for over 3,000 years, a single mine in the Hindu Kush supplied the royal courts of a dozen civilizations spanning 4,000 miles, and this was not sporadic. It was continuous. The mine never stopped producing, the stone never stopped moving, and someone, somewhere, was maintaining the routes that made this possible. The Romans called these routes the Silk Road, but they were following paths that had been walked for millennia before Rome existed. The Persians called it the Royal Road, a network of highways maintained by the Achaemenid Empire in the 5th century BC. The Greek historian Herodotus described it as a marvel of engineering, stretching over 1,600 miles from Sardis in western Turkey to Susa in southwestern Iran. The road was paved in sections, guarded by garrisons, divided into stations where fresh horses were kept for royal messengers, allowing a letter to travel the entire length of the empire in 7 days. But the royal road was not new. It was a renovation. Archaeological surveys of the route show that the underlying infrastructure, the stone foundations, the bridge abutments, the alignment of the road itself predates the Persian Empire by at least 1,000 years. The Persians did not build the royal road. They repaired it, they widened it, they formalized it. But the path was already there, worn into the earth by countless feet carrying lapis, gold, copper, and tin. And the destination was always the same, west. In ancient Egypt, lapis lazuli held a status above gold. It was the color of the night sky, the domain of the goddess Nut, who swallowed the sun each evening and gave birth to it each dawn. Pharaohs were buried with lapis amulets to ensure safe passage through the underworld. Priests ground it into powder and mixed it with binding agents to create a pigment so vibrant it has not faded in 4,000 years. But Egypt has no lapis, no deposits, no local source. Every single piece had to be imported from Afghanistan. A journey of over 2,500 miles across mountains, deserts, and rivers that flooded unpredictably. And yet, the trade never stopped. The tomb of Tutankhamun, opened by Howard Carter in 1922, contained over 5,000 objects. Among them were 11 kilograms of raw lapis lazuli, carefully wrapped in linen and stored in a sealed chest. The stone had been shaped into scarabs, amulets, and inlays, but much of it was left unworked, as if it were being held in reserve. A strategic resource. A form of currency that transcended borders. Because lapis was not just beautiful, it was rare. And rarity, in the ancient world, was synonymous with power. The Mesopotamians understood this. The kings of Uruk and Babylon hoarded lapis the way modern nations hoard oil. They used it to demonstrate wealth, to forge alliances, and to pay tribute. A gift of lapis was a statement. It said, "I have access to the far ends of the earth. I control the roads. I am connected," and the roads were already ancient. In 1937, archaeologists excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur uncovered a lyra, stringed musical instrument dating to 2600 BC. The soundbox was decorated with a mosaic depicting a bull's head, and the bull's beard was made of lapis lazuli. But the craftsmanship was so advanced, so intricate that it suggested the artisans had been working with lapis for generations. This was not experimental, this was mastery. Which means the trade routes had been operating for centuries before this object was even made. The question is not whether trade existed. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is how it was organized. There were no empires in 4000 BC. No centralized governments with the bureaucratic capacity to manage international trade. No maps, no treaties, no customs officials stamping papyrus at border crossings. And yet, a stone from a single mine in Afghanistan was reaching Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley with such regularity that it became a standard component of royal regalia across 3 continents. This requires infrastructure, not just roads, but way stations, water sources, safe passage agreements between tribes, a shared understanding that the traders carrying lapis were not to be killed or robbed, because everyone benefited from the flow of goods. This is what anthropologists call a trade diaspora, a network of merchants who operate across political boundaries, bound by mutual economic interest rather than shared ethnicity or religion. But trade diasporas require trust, and trust requires time. The routes that carried lapis from Sarai Sang to Yor were not blazed in a single generation. They were inherited, passed down from father to son, from guide to apprentice, along with the knowledge of which passes were safe in summer, which wells still held water in drought, and which tribal chiefs would accept copper in exchange for safe passage. And the evidence suggests these routes were far older than 4000 BC. In 2008, a team of geologists analyzing the mineral composition of lapis artifacts from the Royal Cemetery at Ur discovered something unexpected. The chemical signature of the stone matched not just the modern Sarai Sang mine, but a specific vein within that Mina vein that was exhausted and abandoned by 2000 BC. This means the lapis reaching Ur in 2600 BC was being extracted from a section of the mine that had already been worked for over 1,000 years. The mine at Sarai Sang is not a surface deposit. It is a deep vertical shaft, descending over 200 feet into the mountain. The miners work in near total darkness, using oil lamps and hand tools to chip away at the rock. The tunnels are narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and the air is thin and cold. Cave-ins are common. The work is brutal, dangerous, and has remained essentially unchanged for millennia, but the tools have changed. In the deepest sections of the mine, archaeologists have found stone hammers and copper chisels dating back to the Bronze Age. But beneath those layers, in strata that predate 3000 BC, there are tool marks that do not match any known ancient technology. Precision cuts, straight edges, drill holes that are perfectly circular and uniform in diameter, as if they were made with a modern rotary drill rather than a hand-held chisel. This is the same anomaly found at Naya, at Göbekli Tepe, at Baalbek in Lebanon, where the foundation stones of the Roman temple rest on megalithic blocks weighing over 800 tons, cut and placed with a precision that defies explanation. Someone, long before the Bronze Age, had access to tools and techniques that were lost and never recovered, and those same people were moving lapis. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished between 3300 and 1300 BC, was heavily dependent on lapis trade. Seals carved from lapis have been found at every major Indus site, bearing inscriptions in a script that has never been deciphered. The seals were used to mark bales of goods, stamped into wet clay to indicate ownership and origin, and the designs on the seals' bowls, unicorns. Geometric patterns match motifs found on Mesopotamian cylinder seals from the same period. This is not coincidence. This is communication, a shared visual language that transcended spoken words, allowing merchants from different cultures to recognize authenticity and establish trust. But the Indus Valley script vanished around 1300 BC. At the same time, the civilization itself collapsed. The cities were abandoned. The trade networks fractured. And for centuries, lapis stopped flowing west in the quantities it once had. But the mine never closed. Even during the dark ages of the Late Bronze Age collapse, when every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean fell within a span of 50 years, the Sarai-Sang mine continued to produce. Local tribes in Afghanistan kept working the shafts, stockpiling the stone, waiting for the trade routes to reopen, and they did. By the time of the Persian Empire, lapis was flowing again. The royal road became the main artery, carrying lapis from the Hindu Kush through the Zagros Mountains to the workshops of Persepolis and Susa. Persian kings used lapis to decorate their palaces, inlaying it into walls, columns, and furniture. And when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BC, he seized the royal lapis stockpiles and sent them back to Greece, where they were used to create the ultramarine pigments that colored the robes of gods in temple frescoes. The pigment itself was a secret worth killing for. Ultramarine, true ultramarine, made from ground lapis lazuli, was the most expensive color in the ancient world. It cost more than gold by weight. The process of extracting the blue pigment from the stone was complex and labor-intensive, involving repeated grinding, washing, and separation of the mineral particles. A single ounce of pure ultramarine could take a month to produce. And the formula was closely guarded. In medieval Europe, ultramarine was reserved for the most important figures in religious paintings. The robes of the Virgin Mary were always painted in ultramarine, a visual signal of her divine status. Artists who could not afford it used cheaper substitute sagirite, indigo, or smaltbutt. These colors faded and turned gray within decades. Only lapis ultramarine remained vibrant, as if the stone itself refused to die. But by the Renaissance, the source of lapis had become a mystery. European artists knew the pigment came from beyond the sea, hence the name ultramarine, but they did not know where. The Silk Road trade networks had collapsed. The Ottoman Empire controlled the overland routes and blocked European access. For centuries, ultramarine was so rare that contracts for commissioned paintings explicitly stated which figures would be painted in real ultramarine and which would have to make do with substitutes. It was not until 1828 that a French chemist named Jean-Baptiste Guillemot succeeded in synthesizing artificial ultramarine in a laboratory. The price collapsed overnight, and the 6,000-year monopoly of the Sarai-Sang mine finally ended. But the mine is still there, still producing, still worked by hand, the way it has been since the Stone Age. And if you were to take a piece of lapis from the mine today and compare it, using spectrographic analysis, to a piece from Tutankhamun's mask, you would find they are identical. Same mineral composition, same trace elements, same crystalline structure, 6,000 years, and nothing has changed. The stone is the same, the mine is the same, and the route that carried it west through the Hindu Kush, across the Iranian plateau, down to the river valleys of Mesopotamia's, the same route that merchants still walk today, carrying saffron, opium, and smuggled artifacts instead of lapis. The The Silk Road was never invented. It was remembered. A memory encoded in the stone itself, in the blue that refused to fade, in the paths worn into the mountains by feet that walked them long before history began. And every time a caravan leaves Kabul heading west, they are following the same trail. The same wells. The same passes. The trail of the blue stone. The trail of the gods. The trail that has never stopped moving. But the question remains, what made the kings different? If the antediluvian rulers lived for tens of thousands of years, if they presided over a planetary mining operation and tracked celestial cycles that spanned epochs, then their biology could not have been identical to ours. Human cells degrade, telomeres shorten. DNA accumulates errors with each replication. The maximum lifespan of Homo sapiens, even under ideal conditions, does not exceed 120 years. Yet the king list describes reigns lasting 28,000 years, 36,000 years. Lifespans that are not just improbably, they are biologically impossible. Unless the kings were not entirely human, the evidence is written in blood. In 1940, two researchers named Karl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener discovered a protein on the surface of red blood cells. They called it the rhesus factor, named after the rhesus monkeys used in the initial experiments. Most humans carry this protein. Their blood type is classified as Rh positive, but approximately 15% of the global population does not carry the protein. Their blood type is Rh negative, and the distribution of this blood type is not random. Rh negative blood is most common in Europe, particularly in the Basque region of Spain and France, where it appears in over 30% of the population. It is also concentrated in the Berber populations of North Africa, the Kurdish populations of the Middle East, and certain isolated groups in the Caucasus Mountains. Outside of these regions, Rh negative blood is rare. In Asia, it appears in less than 1% of the population. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is virtually non-existent. The distribution suggests a localized origin, a specific genetic mutation that arose in a particular population and then spread, but never fully integrated into the global gene pool. The anomaly deepens when you examine the biology. Rh negative blood is not just the absence of a protein. It is an incompatibility. When an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive fetus, her immune system treats the fetus as a foreign invader and attacks it. This condition, known as hemolytic disease of the newborn, can be fatal without medical intervention. The mother's body is rejecting her own child, as if the two are different species. This does not happen in nature. In no other mammal does the mother's immune system attack her offspring based on blood type. It is a genetic anomaly unique to humans. And it is most common in the populations that claim direct descent from the gods. The Basque people are one of the oldest ethnic groups in Europe. Their language, Euskara, is unrelated to any other language on Earth. It is a linguistic isolate, with no known relatives, no cognates, no evolutionary path. The Basques themselves have oral traditions claiming they are the descendants of survivors from a drowned civilization, a place they call Atlantica. The linguistic and genetic evidence supports this claim. Basque DNA contains markers that do not appear in neighboring populations. They are genetically distinct, and they have the highest concentration of Rh negative blood in the world. The same pattern appears in the Middle East. The Kurdish population, centered in the region where Mesopotamia once flourished, has Rh negative rates significantly higher than surrounding Arab and Turkish populations. The Kurds have their own origin myth. They claim descent from the Medes, an ancient Iranian people who themselves claimed descent from beings who came from the sky. The genetic data shows that Kurdish DNA contains traces of an unknown hominin species, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan. Something else. Something that has not been identified in the fossil record. The Berbers of North Africa tell similar stories. They claim their ancestors arrived by sea, fleeing a great catastrophe in the west. Their language, like Basque, is an isolate. Their DNA, like the Kurds, contains unknown markers, and there are H-negative blood rates, like both groups, are far higher than the global average. The concentration of Rh-negative blood in these specific populations is not random. It correlates directly with the regions where the ancient texts say the gods landed, where the Apkallu emerged from the sea, where the kingship descended from heaven. The Basque region is across the sea from the theoretical location of Atlantis. The Kurdish region is the heartland of Mesopotamia, where Eridu and Kish once stood. The Berber region is North Africa, where Egyptian texts describe gods arriving from the west. These are not coincidences. They are genetic fingerprints. If the antediluvian kings were a distinct genetic lineage, if they were biologically different from the humans they ruled over, then their descendants would carry traces of that difference in their DNA, and the most obvious trace would be a blood type incompatibility, a genetic marker that cannot fully integrate with the broader human population. A shadow of something older, something that should not exist according to the standard model of human evolution. The scientific community has struggled to explain Rh-negative blood. Some researchers have proposed it is a mutation that arose spontaneously in Europe during the Ice Age. But mutations do not cause immune incompatibility between mother and child. Mutations do not create blood types that the body treats as foreign. The only way this could occur is if Rh-negative blood originated from a separate lineage, a population that was genetically distinct enough that when it interbred with Homo sapiens, the resulting hybrids carried a blood protein that the human immune system did not recognize. The king list describes exactly this scenario. The antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. They were advised by the Apkallu beings who were half fish, half human, who came from the Abzu and brought the knowledge of civilization. And at some point during this epoch, according to the Sumerian texts, the gods created a hybrid species, the Lulu, the mixed one, a being with the blood of the gods and the body of a human. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation. In 2005, the Human Genome Project announced the discovery of an anomaly in human DNA. Chromosome 2, the second largest chromosome in the human genome, is the result of a fusion. Two smaller chromosomes, which exist separately in chimpanzees and other primates, were somehow fused together in humans. The fusion point is still visible in the DNA, marked by telomere sequences, the protective caps found at the ends of chromosomes appearing in the middle of chromosome 2. This is not a natural evolutionary process. Chromosomes do not fuse on their own. They require intervention, editing, engineering. The fusion of chromosome 2 is unique to humans. It does not appear in any other primate. It is the single largest genetic difference between humans and chimpanzees, and it occurred relatively recently in evolutionary terms. The exact timing is debated, but most estimates place it between 1 and 2 million years ago, long before modern Homo sapiens appeared in the fossil record. long before the Sumerian king list. But the presence of the fusion suggests that human DNA has been modified at some point in our past, deliberately, intentionally, by something or someone with the knowledge and tools to perform chromosomal engineering. The Sumerian texts describe this process with surprising specificity. Enki, the god of the Absu, takes the clay of the earth, a term that many researchers interpret as a metaphor for genetic material, and mixes it with the blood of a god. The result is a new being, not fully god, not fully human, a hybrid designed to serve a specific function: labor in the mines, cultivation of the fields, construction of temples. The Lulu. If the Lulu were real, if they were the product of genetic engineering performed by the antediluvian administrators, then their descendants would carry genetic markers that do not fit the standard evolutionary model. Anomalies, fusions, blood types that cause immune rejection, and those markers would be most concentrated in the populations that lived closest to the original centers of civilization: Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, North Africa, the Basque region. The data matches Rh-negative blood appears in exactly these populations. Haplogroup X, a rare mitochondrial DNA lineage found in Europe and the Middle East, also appears in isolated Native American populations, suggesting a transatlantic migration that occurred long before Columbus. This haplogroup does not fit the standard Bering Strait migration model. It should not exist in the Americas, yet it does. Concentrated in the Ojibwe and Algonquin tribes of the Great Lakes region, tribes whose oral traditions speak of ancestors who arrived by boat from across the Eastern Sea, fleeing a land that was sinking. The genetic shadow extends beyond blood type. Recent studies of Neanderthal DNA have revealed that modern humans carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal genes, the result of interbreeding that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. But there are other DNA fragments in the human genome that do not match any known hominin species. Ghost populations. Lineages that interbred with Homo sapiens but left no fossils, no bones, no physical evidence beyond their genetic signature embedded in our DNA. One such ghost population has been identified in the DNA of sub-Saharan Africans, another in the DNA of Melanesians and Australian Aboriginals, and a third, unnamed and unidentified, appears in the DNA of European and Middle Eastern populations. The scientific community refers to these as archaic admixtures, unknown ancestors, but the Sumerian texts provide names: the Anunnaki, the gods who came from heaven, and the sages who rose from the Abs. These were not metaphors. They were populations, lineages, species that interbred with humans and then disappeared, leaving behind only their genes and their stories. The king list is not a record of individual rulers. It is a record of a genetic dynasty, a bloodline that lasted for tens of thousands of years because it was biologically distinct. The antediluvian kings were not immortal. They were long-lived because their DNA aged more slowly, repaired itself more efficiently, resisted the degradation that limits human lifespan, and as they interbred with the human population, as their genes mixed with Homo sapiens, the lifespans shortened. The reigns became briefer, the biology diluted, until, by the time of the post-diluvian kings, the average reign was measured in decades, not millennia. This explains the structure of the king list. The antediluvian kings ruled for epochs because they were genetically capable of it. The post-diluvian kings ruled for centuries because they carried only partial amounts of the original genetic material, and the later kings, the ones recorded in historical texts with verifiable reigns of 20 or 30 years, were fully human. The bloodline had been absorbed, integrated. The genetic shadow remained, but the original source was gone. The Rh-negative blood type is the last remnant of that source, a marker in the DNA that says, something different was here, something that does not fully belong to the human evolutionary tree. And it is concentrated in the exact regions where the ancient texts say the gods landed, where the kingship descended from heaven, where the Apkallu emerged from the sea to teach civilization to a species that should not have been ready for it. The immune rejection experienced by Rh-negative mothers carrying Rh-positive children is the body's memory of that difference. The immune system recognizes, on some deep cellular level, that the two blood types are not entirely compatible, that they come from different origins, that one is human, and the other is something else, something older, something that was here long before modern humans walked out of Africa and spread across the planet. The scientific community has no explanation for this. Evolution does not produce blood types that attack offspring. Natural selection does not favor traits that reduce reproductive success. Yet Rh-negative blood persists, concentrated in specific populations, resistant to full integration, as if it is being preserved, protected, maintained by some mechanism that operates outside the normal rules of genetics. The King list offers one possible explanation. The antediluvian bloodline was intentionally preserved. The kings did not rule because they were elected or conquered their way to power. They ruled because they were genetically qualified, born into a lineage that had the biological capacity to live for epochs, to track the stars, to oversee a planetary operation that required continuity across tens of thousands of years. And when that lineage began to dilute, when the genetic markers began to fade, the reigns shortened, the system degraded, and eventually the kingship could no longer function as it had been designed to. The flood accelerated this process. The catastrophe scattered the population. The carefully maintained bloodlines mixed with refugee populations. The genetic purity that had been preserved for epochs was lost in a single generation, and the kings who came after, the post-diluvian rulers, were hybrids, part human, part something else, but no longer capable of the lifespans or the cognitive functions that had defined their ancestors. The Rh-negative blood is what remains, a fragment, a shadow, a genetic echo of beings who lived for tens of thousands of years, who tracked the precession of the equinoxes, who mined gold from the Abzu and built temples aligned with the stars. They are gone now, absorbed into the human population, but their blood remains, flowing through the veins of the Basques, the Kurds, the Berbers, populations who remember, in their myths and their language and their DNA, that they came from somewhere else, that their ancestors were different, that the gods were real. The blood does not lie, the chromosomes do not lie, and the immune system, attacking its own offspring because it recognizes something foreign, remembers what the history books have forgotten, that humanity is not a single species. We are a hybrid, a mixture of lineages that should never have interbred but did, and the result is a genetic shadow that stretches back to the antediluvian world, to the kings who ruled before the flood, to the moment when something from the Abzu rose to the surface and decided to create a new kind of worker. The Lulu did not die out. They survived. They are us. And the Rh-negative blood, concentrated in the regions where the gods descended, is the proof that the Sumerian king list was never mythology. It was a genetic ledger, a record of bloodlines, not individuals, a map of DNA that stretches back 241,000 years, tracking the slow dilution of a species that once lived for epochs and now lives for decades. The kings are gone, but their blood remains, circulating, mixing, fading with each generation, until one day the shadow will disappear entirely, and the only proof that they ever existed will be the clay tablets pressed in Mesopotamia and the strange blood type that refuses to integrate fully with the rest of humanity. The genetic memory does not forget, and somewhere in the DNA of every Rh-negative individual is a fragment of the antediluvian world, still refusing to be fully human. But the water was not the first catastrophe. In the Libyan desert, stretching across thousands of square miles of sand and rock, there is glass, not small fragments, not scattered shards, entire fields of it. Green, translucent, fused silica that lies in chunks the size of human fists, scattered across the surface like the debris of some ancient explosion. The local Bedouin have known about it for centuries. They call it desert glass, and they avoid the areas where it appears most densely, as if the ground itself is cursed. In 1932, a British surveyor named Patrick Clayton was driving across the desert when his vehicle's tires crunched over something that should not have been there. He stopped, got out, and found himself standing in a field of glass that extended in every direction as far as he could see. The glass was pure, nearly flawless, and it was scattered across the sand in a pattern that suggested it had fallen from above, like rain. Chemical analysis of the glass revealed something impossible. It is composed of nearly pure silicon dioxide, fused at temperatures exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius. That is hotter than any natural desert fire, hotter than any volcanic eruption. The only known process that can generate temperatures high enough to fuse sand into glass on this scale is a nuclear explosion or an asteroid impact. And there are no volcanoes in the Libyan desert, no evidence of nuclear weapons, just the glass, lying on the surface, waiting. The distribution pattern is wrong for a meteor impact. If an asteroid had struck the desert, there would be a crater. A central point of impact surrounded by ejecta radiating outward in a circle, but there is no crater. The glass is spread across multiple sites, separated by hundreds of miles, as if the heat source had been atmospheric, as if something had exploded in the sky, raining fire down across the entire region. This glass is not unique to Libya. Similar fields of fused silica have been found in the Sahara, in the Arabian Desert, in the Gobi Desert, in the deserts of Australia and South America. Everywhere the sand is old and undisturbed, there is glass, melted, vitrified, frozen in the moment of its transformation from solid to liquid and back again. The global distribution suggests a global event, something that happened not in one location, but across the entire planet, something that turned sand into glass in a single, violent instant. The Sumerian texts describe this event. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero witnesses the destruction of the world by fire. The text reads, "The gods were frightened by the deluge, and, shrinking back, they ascended to the heaven of Ain. The gods cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. For 6 days and 6 nights the wind blew, torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. When the 7th day dawned, the storm from the south subsided, the sea grew calm, the flood was stilled." The description is specific. The destruction comes from the south. It begins with fire, torrent, and tempest, before the water arrives, and the gods themselves flee, not to the mountains, not to the temples, to the heaven of Anu, to the sky. As if the surface of the earth had become uninhabitable, the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the only text that describes this sequence. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew text, describes stars falling from heaven and setting the earth ablaze. The Hindu Mahabharata describes a weapon called Brahmastra that unleashes fire so intense it turns sand to glass and boils the oceans. The Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, describes a rain of fire that destroys the world before the Great Flood. These are not isolated myths. They are consistent descriptions of the same event, recorded by cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The geological evidence supports these accounts. Beneath the surface of the earth, in sediment cores taken from oceans, lakes, and ice sheets, there is a layer of black material. It appears at the same depth in cores taken from every continent. Geologists call it the younger dryas boundary layer, or the black mat. It is composed of carbon, soot, and microscopic diamonds nanodiamonds that can only form under extreme pressure and heat. The kind of pressure and heat generated by a massive explosion. The black mat dates to 12,800 years ago, the exact moment when the younger driest cold period began, the exact moment when global temperatures plummeted, ice sheets advanced, and sea levels dropped, the exact moment when the antediluvian world, according to the Sumerian king list, was interrupted by catastrophe. But the black mat is not just carbon. It contains other materials, platinum, iridium, rare earth elements that are uncommon in the Earth's crust but abundant in asteroids and comets. The presence of these elements suggests that the explosion was not volcanic. It was extraterrestrial. Something from space struck the atmosphere with enough force to detonate in mid-air, scattering debris across the entire planet and igniting fires that burned for days. This is called an airburst. When a comet or asteroid enters the atmosphere at high velocity, the friction and compression heat the object to thousands of degrees. If the object is large enough and moving fast enough, it explodes before it hits the ground. The resulting shockwave flattens everything within hundreds of miles. The heat pulse incinerates forests, and the debris, falling back to Earth, ignites secondary fires that spread across continents. The Tunguska event in Siberia, which occurred in 1908, is the most recent example of an airburst. A comet fragment approximately 50 meters in diameter exploded over the remote forests of Russia, flattening 80 million trees across an area of 2,000 square kilometers. There was no crater, no impact site, just a massive explosion in the sky and a scorched landscape that burned for weeks. If a similar event occurred 12,000 years ago, but with a comet fragment 10 or 20 times larger, the devastation would have been planetary. The desert glass is the evidence. The black mat is the evidence. And the sudden drop in global temperatures following the event confirms that something disrupted the climate on a massive scale. The leading theory is that the fires, burning across millions of square miles, released so much soot and ash into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a decade. The ice sheets, which had been melting, began to advance again, and the coastlines, which had been stable, began to shift as ocean currents changed and weather patterns collapsed. This was the fire that preceded the flood. The Younger Dryas event was not a single catastrophe. It was a cascading collapse, triggered by an airburst that set the world on fire, followed by a nuclear winter that froze the planet, followed by a rapid thaw when the soot finally settled and the sun returned. The final phase of this collapse was meltwater pulse 1b, the moment when the ice sheets destabilized by the initial heating and the subsequent freeze-thaw cycles collapsed into the ocean and raised sea levels by several meters in a matter of years. The Sumerian king list marks this entire sequence as a single event. Then the flood swept over, but the texts describing the flood consistently mention fire first. The water came after. The sequence is fire, ice, water. And the antediluvian kings, who had presided over a world of stable climate and predictable sea levels for tens of thousands of years, watched as their entire system collapsed in the span of a single generation. The impact was not random. The trajectory, the timing, the devastation, all of it points to a specific moment in Earth's astronomical cycle. 12,800 years ago, the planet was passing through the debris field of a fragmenting comet. This is not speculation. Astronomers have identified the source, Comet EMC, a short-period comet that orbits the Sun every 3 years. The comet has been breaking apart for millennia, leaving a trail of debris in its wake. Every year, when Earth passes through this debris field, we experience meteor showers, the torids, small fragments burning up harmlessly in the atmosphere. But 12,000 years ago, the fragments were not small. They were massive. Boulder-sized chunks of ice and rock, traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, slamming into the atmosphere and detonating with the force of nuclear weapons. The impacts were concentrated in the northern hemisphere, centered over the Laurentide ice sheet that covered North America. The heat from the airbursts melted millions of tons of ice instantaneously. The resulting meltwater flooded into the Atlantic Ocean, disrupting the Gulf Stream and triggering the younger Dryas cold snap. And the fires, ignited by the heat pulses, spread across the forests and grasslands, turning the sky black with smoke. The desert glass in Libya, in the Sahara, in Arabia, is the remnant of these airbursts. The sand, heated to temperatures exceeding volcanic eruptions, fused into glass and fell back to the ground like frozen rain. The fields of glass are not evenly distributed. They cluster in specific patterns, suggesting multiple impact sites, multiple explosions, a barrage of fire that lasted for hours, perhaps days, as Earth moved through the densest part of the debris field. The Sumerian texts capture the terror of this moment. In the Atrahasis epic, another flood narrative that predates the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods decide to destroy humanity because the noise of civilization has become unbearable. But the destruction they unleash is not controlled. The text describes the gods losing control of their own weapon, watching in horror as the fire spreads beyond their intentions. Enki, who had warned the human Atrahasis to build a boat, is described as weeping when he sees the scale of the devastation. The text reads, "The gods were terrified at the deluge. They fled and ascended to the heaven of Anu, crouching like dogs against the outer wall." This is not the language of mythology. This is the language of eyewitness testimony. The gods, the antediluvian administrators, did not cause the catastrophe. They witnessed it, and they were as helpless as the humans they ruled over. The fire came from the sky. It could not be stopped. It could not be controlled. And when it finally ended, when the flames died and the smoke cleared, the world had been transformed. The black matte layer preserves the moment. In sediment cores taken from across North America, The layer is dense with charcoal, soot, and the remains of burned megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, all of them extinct within a narrow window of time corresponding to the Younger Dryas boundary. The extinction was not gradual, it was sudden, catastrophic, and it coincides exactly with the layer of diamonds, platinum, and iridium that marks the airburst. The animals did not die from the cold. They died from the fire. The ice age that followed was the consequence, not the cause. And by the time the ice melted, by the time meltwater pulse 1b raised the sea levels and flooded the coastlines, the survivors were few, scattered, traumatized. The cities were gone, the infrastructure was gone, the calendar was disrupted, and the kings, who had ruled for epochs, could no longer maintain the system they had built. The glass fields are a monument to that moment. They are not natural formations. They are scars, evidence of a planetary trauma that reset the clock and forced humanity to begin again. And the fact that the Sumerian king list acknowledges this event, that it divides history into before the flood and after the flood, suggests the scribes understood that the flood was not just water. It was the culmination of a sequence that began with fire. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim, the Sumerian equivalent of Noah, sealing his boat with bitumen and waiting as the fire rains down. The text says, "With the first light of dawn, a black cloud came from the horizon. Inside it, Adad thundered, while Shulat and Hanish went in front, moving as heralds over hill and plain." The stillness that came with the approach was like the silence before a storm. Adad is the storm god. Shulat and Hanish are minor deities associated with atmospheric phenomena. But the description is precise. A black cloud, thunder, silence. These are the characteristics of an atmospheric shockwave, the kind generated by an airburst. The stillness before the storm is the moment when the pressure wave arrives, compressing the air, silencing all sound. And then the explosion, the fire, the glass rain, the survivors, the ones who made it through the fire and the ice and the water, carried the memory. They carved it into stone. They pressed it into clay. They encoded it in myths that would be retold for thousands of years, ensuring that future generations would know, the world ended once, it can end again, and the signs will be the same. Fire from the sky, darkness, silence, and then the water. The antediluvian world did not simply fade, it was incinerated. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years watched as their system, their civilization, their carefully calibrated infrastructure was destroyed in a matter of days. The astronomical observatories burned, the mines flooded, the workers scattered, and the bloodline, the genetic dynasty that had maintained continuity for epochs, was diluted by refugees and survivors who had no connection to the old system. The Younger Dryas was the reset. The black mat is the boundary line between the old world and the new. And the desert glass, scattered across the planet in fields of frozen fire, is the physical proof that the flood described in the king list was not a myth. It was the final act in a planetary catastrophe that began with a rain of comets and ended with the drowning of every coastal city on Earth. The glass is cold now, silent, but it remembers the heat. The violence, the moment when the sky turned black and the sand turned to liquid, and the world, as the antediluvian kings had known it, ceased to exist. The Sumerian texts do not describe the fire in detail. They focus on the water, but the fire is there, hidden in the poetry, buried in the descriptions of gods fleeing to the heavens and storms coming from the south. The scribes knew, they remembered, and they encoded the sequence into their flood narratives, ensuring that anyone who read the texts carefully would understand. The flood was not the beginning, it was the end. The glass lies in the desert, waiting, a testament to the fire that came before the water. A reminder that the antediluvian world did not simply sink beneath the waves. It burned first, and the ashes of that burning are pressed into the black mat, layered into the sediment, frozen into the ice cores, scattered across the deserts in fields of green, translucent glass that should not exist. The kings watched the sky turn to fire. They watched the cities burn. They watched the ice melt and the water rise. And when it was over, when the survivors emerged from their boats and their mountain refuges, they looked at the devastated landscape and understood that the old world was gone. The kingship would have to be lowered from heaven again. The calendar would have to be recalculated. The system would have to be rebuilt from scratch. But they never forgot the fire. They carved it into their myths. They pressed it into their clay tablets, and they left behind the glass, scattered across the desert, as evidence that the fire was real. That the gods were not invincible. That the world can end. That it has ended before. And that it will end again. But the survivors did not forget everything. In the ruins of Nineveh, among the 30,000 tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal, there is a circular clay disc, roughly 5 inches in diameter. It is covered in cuneiform script, arranged in a spiral pattern, radiating outward from the center like the arms of a galaxy. For over a century, the disc sat in the British Museum, catalogued as an administrative record, a grain tax, a boundary marker, something mundane, until 1999, when a researcher named Alan Bond noticed something strange. The markings on the disc were not text, they were coordinates, angular measurements, astronomical observations recorded with a level of precision that should not have been possible for a civilization without telescopes, without sextants, without any of the tools we associate with celestial navigation. Bond brought in a colleague, Mark Hempsel, an aerospace engineer specializing in orbital mechanics. Together, they began to decode the disk. What they found was impossible. The disk is a star map, but not of the night sky as it appears from Earth. It is a map of the sky as it appeared on a specific date, at a specific time, from a specific location. The date, June 29, 3123 BC. The time, pre-dawn. The location, the mountains of Austria. And the event being recorded, an asteroid impact. The disk, now known as the planisphere of Nineveh, is not a record of mythology. It is an impact log. A forensic document created by someone who witnessed an asteroid entering the atmosphere, tracked its trajectory across the sky, calculated its angle of descent, and determined its impact site with enough precision to mark it on a map. The level of mathematical sophistication required to do this is staggering. It requires an understanding of spherical geometry, trigonometry, and the ability to convert observations made from one location into coordinates that would be valid from another location thousands of miles away. The Sumerians should not have been capable of this. They lived 4,000 years before Newton, 5,000 years before Galileo, yet the planisphere proves they were not just watching the sky, they were calculating it, measuring it, recording events with the precision of modern astronomers. And they were doing it not with computers or satellites, but with clay and a stylus, pressing coordinates into wet mud and firing it so the record would survive for millennia. The asteroid recorded on the planisphere was not small. Bond and Hempsel calculated its size based on the trajectory and the atmospheric disruption described in the markings. The object was approximately 1 kilometer in diameter, large enough to generate a shock wave visible from hundreds of miles away, large enough to leave a crater. And when they traced the trajectory to its conclusion, when they identified the impact site marked on the disk, they found something chilling. The Caffels landslide. A massive geological scar in the Austrian Alps where an entire mountainside collapsed at some point in the distant past, burying the valley below under millions of tons of debris. Geologists have debated the cause of the landslide for decades. Some argue it was seismic. Others suggest glacial melt. But no one could explain why the rock at the impact site shows signs of vitrification, melting, fusion, the same kind of heat signature found in the Libyan desert glass. The planisphere explains it. An asteroid struck the mountain at a shallow angle, transferring its kinetic energy into the rock and triggering a catastrophic landslide. The heat from the impact fused the stone. The shockwave flattened the surrounding forests. And somewhere in Mesopotamia, over 2,000 miles away, a Sumerian astronomer recorded the event in such detail that 4,000 years later, engineers could use the coordinates to identify the exact impact site. This level of observational astronomy requires infrastructure, observatories, trained personnel, a system for recording and preserving data across generations, and it requires a reason, a purpose. You do not build a planetary monitoring network unless you are expecting something, unless you know that the sky is dangerous, that objects fall from it, that the fire can come again. The antediluvian kings knew this. They had lived through the Younger Dryas event. They had watched the sky turn to fire. They had seen the comets fragment and the airbursts ignite the atmosphere. And when the survivors rebuilt, when they re-established the kingship in Kish and Uruk and Ur, they did not forget. They built observatories. They trained astronomers. They created a system for tracking every object in the sky, every anomaly, every deviation from the expected pattern, because they understood that the next catastrophe was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The planisphere is proof of this system. It is not an isolated artifact. It is part of a larger network of astronomical records that span thousands of years. The Sumerians tracked the movements of Venus with such precision that they could predict its position decades in advance. They recorded eclipses, planetary conjunctions, the precession of the equinoxes, and they encoded all of this data using the Base 60 mathematical system, a framework so efficient that it is still used today in every clock, every compass, every navigational chart. The Base 60 system is not arbitrary, it is astronomical. A circle divides naturally into 60 degrees because 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it ideal for calculating angles, tracking celestial motion, and converting between different units of measurement. If you are building a civilization that depends on accurate timekeeping, on predicting the movements of the stars, on synchronizing rituals and agricultural cycles with celestial events, you need a mathematical system that can handle complex divisions without generating fractions. Base 60 provides that, but the Sumerians did not invent it. They inherited it. The system appears fully formed in the earliest Sumerian texts, with no evidence of gradual development or trial and error. It is there from the beginning, as if it had been handed down from someone who had already perfected it, someone who had been using it for so long that it had become second nature, someone who thought in base 60 the way we think in base. The antediluvian kings thought in base 60. They ruled for epochs, measured in sexagesimal notation. 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Numbers that divide cleanly into 60, into 360, into the great year of 25,920 years. The rains were not random. They were calibrated, synchronized with the precessional cycle. And the base 60 system was the language of that synchronization. The Dendera zodiac confirms this. In the Temple of Hathor, at Dendera, Egypt, there is a circular stone carving on the ceiling of a chamber built during the Ptolemaic period. Around 50 BC, the carving shows the constellations of the zodiac arranged in a circle, with figures representing the 12 signs surrounding a central axis. At first glance, it appears to be a standard astrological chart, but the positioning of the constellations is wrong. They are not aligned with the sky as it appeared in 50 BC, they are aligned with the sky as it appeared thousands of years earlier. Astronomers who have studied the Dendera zodiac have calculated the date encoded in the carving. The precessional alignment corresponds to approximately 10,500 BC. The exact period when the antediluvian world was collapsing, when the fire came, when the ice melted, when the flood swept over. The Egyptians did not create this zodiac. They copied it. They preserved a star map that had been passed down through generations, maintained in temples, recarved into stone whenever the original began to erode, because the knowledge it contained was too important to lose. The Dendera zodiac is a time capsule, a record of the sky as it appeared during the antediluvian epoch, and the fact that it was still being preserved and copied in 50 BC, over 10,000 years after the original observation, proves that the astronomical knowledge of the antediluvian kings did not die with them. It was transmitted, encoded, hidden in temples and libraries and mathematical systems, waiting for a future civilization to rediscover it. The Sumerian king list serves the same function. It is not a historical record in the conventional sense. It is a chronological anchor, a way of marking epochs, of preserving the memory of deep time, of ensuring that future generations would know that civilization did not begin 5,000 years ago. It began much earlier, and it was interrupted, reset, forced to start over after a catastrophe that destroyed the infrastructure but not the knowledge. The scribes who copied the king list understood this. They preserved the impossible numbers because the numbers were the point. They were proof that someone had been counting, tracking, measuring time across epochs. And the fact that the numbers correspond to astronomical cycles, to the precession of the equinoxes, to the sexagesimal division of the great year, proves that the antediluvian kings were not mythological figures. They were chronological markers, designations for specific eras in a calendar system that spanned hundreds of thousands of years. This is why the king list was copied so many times, why 16 different versions of it have been found, each one faithfully reproducing the same names, the same cities, the same reign lengths. The scribes were not recording history. They were preserving a calendar, a cosmic clock, a system for tracking the slow rotation of the stars and ensuring that the knowledge of precession, of base 60 mathematics, of astronomical observation, would survive even if the civilization that created it did not. The planisphere of Nineveh is part of this system. It records a specific event and asteroid impact, but it does so using the same mathematical framework, the same sexagesimal notation, the same astronomical precision that defines the king list. The two documents are connected. They are products of the same civilization, the same mindset, the same obsession with tracking the sky and preserving the data for future generations. And the obsession was justified. The planisphere proves that the antediluvian survivors were still monitoring the sky, still watching for the next impact, still recording every anomaly, because they knew the comets would return. The debris field that had caused the Younger Dryas event was not a one-time occurrence. Earth passes through it every year, and every few thousand years, the fragments are large enough to be dangerous. Large enough to burn forests, to melt ice sheets, to end civilizations. The antediluvian kings built their astronomical observatories not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They were tracking threats, monitoring the sky for objects that could destroy everything they had built. And when they saw something, when they calculated a trajectory, when they determined that an impact was imminent, they recorded it, preserved the data, ensured that future generations would know that the sky is not benign, that the universe is hostile, that survival depends on constant vigilance. The planisphere is dated to 3123 BC. Over 1,000 years after the flood, the antediluvian system had survived. The observatories were still functioning. The astronomers were still trained in basic D mathematics. The knowledge had been preserved across the catastrophe, passed down through the post-Diluvian kings, maintained in temples and libraries until it could be recorded in clay and fired into permanence. But the system was degrading. The planisphere is one of the last detailed astronomical records from Mesopotamia. After 3000 BC, the records become less precise, less frequent. The infrastructure was collapsing. The trained astronomers were dying out. The knowledge was fragmenting into myth and legend. By the time of the Babylonians, by the time of the Assyrians, the basic D system was still in use, but the reason for it had been forgotten. They used it to measure grain and count days, not to track the precession of the equinoxes or predict asteroid impacts. The king list became a myth. The planisphere became a curiosity. And the Dendera zodiac became a religious symbol. Its astronomical significance buried under layers of interpretation and ritual. The knowledge was still there, preserved in the artifacts, encoded in the mathematics, waiting for someone with the tools and the training to decode it. But the context was lost, the purpose was forgotten, and the antediluvian system, which had tracked the stars for tens of thousands of years, finally went silent. Yet the artifacts remain. The planisphere sits in the British Museum, its coordinates still accurate, its calculations still verifiable. The Dendera zodiac hangs in the Louvre, its precessional alignment still pointing to 10,500 BC. The Sumerian king list, copied and recopied across 16 different tablets, still lists the same impossible reigns, the same astronomical epochs, the same evidence that someone was counting. And the base 60 system, invented or inherited by the antediluvian kings, is still in use today. Every time we check a clock, every time we measure an angle, every time we divide a circle into 360 degrees, we are using their system. their mathematics, their framework for tracking time and space. The antediluvian civilization is not dead. It is embedded in the foundations of everything we do, hidden in plain sight, encoded in the way we measure the world. The Library of the Stars was never a single building. It was a system, a network of observatories, temples, and trained astronomers who spent generations watching the sky, recording the data, and preserving it in a format that could survive fire, flood, and the collapse of empires. The clay tablets were the backup drives. The mathematical system was the operating system. And the king list was the chronological index, marking the epochs, ensuring that anyone who found it would know. Time is deeper than you think. Civilization is older than you remember. And the stars, still turning in their slow eternal rotation, are still being watched by someone. The planisphere is a message, a warning, a reminder that the sky is not empty, that objects fall from it, that the fire can come again. And the only defense is knowledge, observation, the ability to see the threat coming and prepare. The antediluvian kings understood this. They built the system. They maintained it for epochs. And when the fire came, when the ice melted, when the flood swept over, they encoded the knowledge into clay and stone and mathematics, ensuring that future generations would have the tools to rebuild, to remember, to watch the sky. The stars do not forget. The clay does not forget. And the Base 60 system, still ticking in every clock on Earth, remembers the civilization that created it. The kings who ruled for epochs, the astronomers who tracked the comets, the scribes who pressed the impossible numbers into wet mud and fired them into eternity. The Library of the Stars is still open, still transmitting, still waiting for someone to finally understand what the antediluvian kings were trying to tell us. The sky is watching, and we should be watching back. But while the overland roads withered, a different kind of road was being built, one made of water and wind. In the year 1405, nearly 60 years after the Black Death had peaked, and while Europe was still recovering from the devastation, a fleet unlike anything the world had ever seen assembled in the port of Nanjing, China. Over 300 ships, carrying 27,000 men. And at the center of this armada were 9 vessels, so massive they defied belief. The treasure ships, 400 feet long, 160 feet wide, 9 masts, watertight compartments, and a displacement of over 3,000 tons. To put this in perspective, Christopher Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, which would sail across the Atlantic 87 years later, was 85 feet long and displaced 100 tons. The Chinese treasure ships were nearly 5 times longer and 30 times heavier. They were floating cities, mobile fortresses, and they were commanded by a man who would become one of history's most enigmatic figures. Admiral Zhang He. Zhang He was a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan province. He had been captured as a boy during the Ming dynasty's conquest of the region, castrated, and pressed into service in the imperial household. But he had risen through the ranks through a combination of intelligence, loyalty, and an uncanny ability to organize complex operations. By 1405, he was the most trusted naval commander of the Yongle Emperor, tasked with a mission that was as much political as it was commercial. The mission was to extend Chinese influence across the maritime Silk Road, to establish tributary relationships with kingdoms from Southeast Asia to East Africa, to demonstrate, unmistakably, that the Ming dynasty was the dominant power in the world, and to find new trade routes, because the old ones were dying. The overland Silk Road, devastated by plague and fragmented by political collapse, was no longer reliable. The Mongol Empire had shattered into competing khanates. Central Asia had descended into chaos, and the rising Ottoman Turks were beginning to close the western gates, imposing heavy tariffs on goods moving through their territory and, in some cases, blocking European access entirely. The world needed a new road, and Zheng He was going to build it on water. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 major expeditions across the Indian Ocean. His fleets visited over 30 countries. They reached the coast of East Africa, stopping at ports in modern-day Kenya and Tanzania. They explored the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Arabian Peninsula. And everywhere they went, they carried gifts: silk, porcelain, tea, gold, not as trade goods, but as tribute from the Emperor of China, offered freely to demonstrate wealth and power. This was not colonization, it was theater. A carefully choreographed display of superiority designed to awe and intimidate. And it worked. Local rulers, confronted by a fleet of ships larger than anything they had ever seen, accepted tributary status. They sent envoys back to China bearing exotic gifts: giraffes, lions, ostriches, precious woods, and spices. These gifts were presented to the Yongle Emperor in lavish ceremonies, reinforcing the narrative that all the world's kingdoms acknowledged Chinese supremacy. But beneath the pageantry, something more practical was happening. Trade networks were being established, maps were being drawn, and the knowledge of how to navigate the maritime Silk Road, the monsoon winds, the currents, the safe harbors was being systematically recorded and disseminated. The Chinese were not the first to sail these waters. Arab and Indian merchants had been crossing the Indian Ocean for centuries, but they had done it in small ships, following routes passed down through oral tradition. Zheng He's expeditions were different. They were scientific, systematic, and they left behind a cartographic legacy that would shape maritime trade for the next 200 years. But then, abruptly, they stopped. In 1433, the Yongle Emperor died. His successor, the Hongxi Emperor, had different priorities. He viewed the treasure voyages as wasteful vanity projects that drained the treasury without producing tangible benefits. The ships, he argued, brought back exotic animals and symbolic tribute, but they did not generate revenue. They did not defend the northern borders, where nomadic tribes still threatened the empire, and they tied up resources that could be better spent on internal development. So he ended them. The treasure ships were left to rot in harbor, the naval infrastructure was dismantled, and China, which had possessed the most advanced maritime technology in the world, turned inward. The Ming dynasty instituted a policy called Hijin the Sea Ban, which prohibited private maritime trade and restricted coastal communities from building large ships. The goal was to consolidate control, to prevent smuggling and piracy, and to redirect China's focus toward land-based defense. But the policy had an unintended consequence. It handed maritime dominance to anyone willing to take it. And halfway around the world, in a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, someone was willing. Portugal, in 1400, was poor, isolated, trapped between the Atlantic Ocean and the larger, more powerful kingdom of Castile. It had no access to the overland Silk Road, no trade agreements with the Ottomans, and no way to compete with the Italian city-states that dominated Mediterranean commerce. But it had one advantage: a coastline, and a king who understood that the sea was the future. Prince Henry of Portugal, later known as Henry the Navigator, was not a sailor. He rarely went to sea himself. But he was an organizer, a visionary, and he understood something that most European rulers did not. The overland Silk Road was closed, but the maritime route was open. All Portugal had to do was find it. Starting in 1419, Henry began sponsoring expeditions down the western coast of Africa, not to conquer, not to colonize, but to map, to learn, to push farther south with each voyage, testing the limits of what was possible. The ships were small caravels, 60 feet long, 3-masted, highly maneuverable, designed to sail into the wind, a capability that allowed them to explore and return, rather than being forced to follow one-way trade winds like earlier vessels. They carried crews of 20 to 30 men. They had no cannons, no luxury quarters, no space for cargo. They were scouts, and they were expendable. For decades, they crept down the African coast, each expedition pushing a little farther, mapping every bay, every river mouth, every anchorage, and slowly, painfully, they began to piece together the shape of the continent. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa. The Cape of Good Hope hand entered the Indian Ocean. For the first time, a European ship had found a sea route to the east that bypassed the Ottoman-controlled Mediterranean entirely. 9 years later, Vasco da Gama followed that route all the way to India. He arrived in Calicut in 1498, carrying a letter from the Portuguese king requesting trade. The local ruler, the Zamarin of Calicut, was unimpressed. The gifts da Gama brought cloth hats and honey were considered insultingly cheap compared to the wealth flowing through Arab and Indian trade networks. But da Gama had not come to impress. He had come to establish a foothold, and he did. Within a decade, Portuguese ships were making regular voyages to India, carrying European silver and returning with spices that had once traveled overland through Ottoman territory. The profit margins were staggering. A cargo of pepper purchased in India and sold in Lisbon could generate returns of over 1,000%. And because the Portuguese controlled the sea route, they could bypass every middleman who had once taken a cut along the overland Silk Road. The economic consequences were immediate and devastating for the old trade networks. The price of spices in Europe, which had been artificially inflated by Ottoman tariffs and Venetian monopolies, collapsed. Venetian merchants, who had grown rich on their exclusive access to Eastern goods, found themselves undercut by Portuguese traders who could deliver the same products at half the cost. The great trading cities of Central Asia's Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar saw their caravans dwindle as merchants diverted their goods to coastal ports where they could be loaded onto ships instead of camels. The overland Silk Road did not die in a single moment. But the arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean was the beginning of the end. And then, in 1453, the final gate closed. The Ottoman Empire, under Sultan Mehmed II, laid siege to Constantinople. The city had stood for over 1,000 years as the gateway between Europe and Asia, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, and the most heavily fortified position in the world. Its walls were 15 feet thick. Its harbor was protected by a massive chain that could be raised to block enemy ships, and its defenders, though vastly outnumbered, had held off countless sieges throughout history. But Mehmed brought something new. Cannons, massive bronze siege guns capable of hurling 600-pound stone balls over a mile. The largest of these guns, nicknamed Basilica, was 27 feet long and required a crew of 200 men to operate. It could only be fired 7 times per day because the barrel needed time to cool between shots. But each shot shattered sections of wall that had stood for centuries. The siege lasted 57 days. On May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces breached the walls and poured into the city. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the streets, his body never identified, and the city that had once been the jewel of Christendom became Istanbul, the capital of a new Islamic empire. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military defeat. It was a symbolic and economic rupture. The Ottomans now controlled the Bosporus Strait, the only sea route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They controlled the overland routes through Anatolia and the Levant, and they had no interest in allowing European merchants free access. Ottoman tariffs on goods transiting through their territory increased dramatically. In some cases, they simply refused passage altogether. The Venetians, who had maintained trading privileges in Constantinople for centuries, found themselves squeezed between rising costs and falling prices as Portuguese spices flooded European markets. By 1500, Venice's dominance of the spice trade was over. Europe, cut off from the east by Ottoman power, had no choice but to look for alternatives, and the sea was the only option left. This is the moment when the age of exploration truly began, not as a romantic quest for discovery, but as a desperate economic necessity. The Spanish, watching Portuguese success with envy, began sponsoring their own expeditions. Christopher Columbus, convinced he could reach Asia by sailing west, stumbled upon the Americas in 1492. Ferdinand Magellan, attempting to find a western route to the Spice Islands, became the first to circumnavigate the globe in 1522. And the Dutch, entering the game late but with superior financial organization, established the Dutch East India Company in 1602, creating the world's first publicly traded corporation. The maritime Silk Road became the new arteries of global commerce, and the old overland routes, which had connected civilizations for thousands of years, faded into memory. But there is an irony buried in this transition, one that reveals the cyclical nature of empires and trade. The Chinese treasure ships, which had dominated the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s, were technologically superior to anything the Portuguese possessed. They were larger, faster, and more seaworthy. They carried advanced navigational tools, including magnetic compasses and detailed star charts, and they had the backing of the wealthiest empire on earth. But China turned inward, and Portugal, with its tiny ships and desperate ambition, inherited the sea. The difference was not technology, it was philosophy. The Ming dynasty saw maritime trade as a cost, a drain on resources that produced symbolic but not tangible returns. The Portuguese saw it as an investment, a way to bypass political barriers and access markets that had been closed to them for centuries. And this difference in perspective changed the world. By 1600, European powers controlled the maritime routes to Asia. By 1700, they controlled much of the Asian coastline itself. And by 1800, the very kingdoms that Zheng He had visited as tributaries of China were colonized by European empires that had not even existed when the treasure ships sailed. The overland Silk Road, meanwhile, became a relic, a historical curiosity. The cities that had once been the wealthiest in the world, Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, became provincial backwaters. ruled by local khans and largely ignored by the great powers. The caravanserais crumbled, the yam stations were abandoned, and the routes themselves, though still walked by local traders and pilgrims, carried only a fraction of the goods they once had. The shift from land to sea was not just a change in transportation methods, it was a fundamental restructuring of global power. The civilizations that had dominated the overland Silk Road, the Mongols, the Persians, the Central Asian city-states lost their strategic importance, and the civilizations that controlled the coasts, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and eventually Britain, rose to dominance. But the sea routes had their own vulnerabilities: pirates, storms, scurvy, shipwrecks. The mortality rate on early maritime expeditions was appalling. Vasco da Gama's first voyage to India lost over half its crew to disease and violence. Magellan's circumnavigation started with 5 ships and 270 men. Only 1 ship and 18 men returned. And yet, the voyages continued, because the profits justified the risk. A single successful voyage could make a merchant wealthy for life, and the European powers, driven by competition and greed, poured resources into building better ships, training better sailors, and mapping the oceans with increasing precision. By 1700, the maritime Silk Road had become more efficient, more profitable, and more important than the overland routes had ever been. Goods that once took months to move by caravan could now be shipped in weeks by sea, and the volume of trade increased exponentially. Millions of tons of spices, silk, tea, porcelain, and precious metals moved between Asia and Europe every year, enriching the merchants and governments that controlled the routes. But something was lost in this transition. The overland Silk Road had been more than just a trade route. It had been a cultural exchange, a meeting place where ideas, religions, and technologies mixed and transformed. The maritime routes, by contrast, were more transactional. Goods moved, but people did not. The ships carried cargo, not pilgrims, and the sailors who worked them rarely ventured far from the coastal ports. The cosmopolitan cities of the Silk Road, Dunhuang, Samarkand, Kashgar, had been places where Greek philosophers could debate with Buddhist monks, where Persian engineers could share techniques with Chinese craftsmen, where the world condensed into a single crossroads. The maritime empires created factories and trading posts, but they did not create that kind of synthesis. The cultures remained separate, divided by the ocean and by the colonial hierarchies that European powers imposed. And so, the Silk Road died. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet fade. The caravans stopped, the cities emptied, and the desert reclaimed the roads, covering them with sand and silence. But the memory remained, encoded in the ruins, in the stories, in the genetic markers of populations that still carry the signatures of ancient migrations, and in the knowledge that once, long ago, the world was connected, not by conquest, but by commerce, not by empires, but by individuals willing to walk 4,000 miles across deserts and mountains in search of something rare, something valuable, something worth the journey. The sea was faster, but the road was first. But the road never truly died, it only slept. In the year 2013, the president of China stood before an audience in Kazakhstan and announced a new vision, a $1 trillion infrastructure project that would rebuild the ancient trade routes, connecting east and west roads, railways, ports, pipelines, fiber optic cables, all following the same paths that merchants had walked for thousands of years. He called it the Belt and Road Initiative, and the world called it the New Silk Road. The official narrative describes it as an economic development program, a way to connect over 60 countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa through improved infrastructure and increased trade. Over 140 nations have signed agreements. Over $1 trillion has been committed, and the construction is already underway. But the routes being built are not new. They are restorations. The railway line from China to Germany follows almost exactly the path of the ancient Silk Road through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Russia. The deep-water port being built in Gwadar, Pakistan, sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the same strategic choke point that controlled maritime trade for centuries. And the network of roads being constructed through Central Asia traces the same mountain passes, the same river valleys, the same oasis cities that sustained caravans 2,000 years ago. The Chinese government does not call this a coincidence. In official documents, they explicitly reference the historical Silk Road as the blueprint for modern development. The Belt and Road Initiative is framed not as innovation, but as restoration, as if the roads were always meant to be there, as if they were simply waiting for someone to remember them. And beneath the economic rhetoric, there is a deeper pattern emerging. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just about moving goods, it is about moving data. The project includes a digital Silk Road, a network of satellites, undersea cables, and 5G infrastructure designed to connect the entire region into a single integrated communication system. This is the modern equivalent of the Mongol YAM network, a high-speed relay system capable of transmitting information across continents in seconds rather than weeks. But unlike the YAM, which was limited by the speed of horses, the digital Silk Road operates at the speed of light. Messages that once took 14 days to travel from Beijing to Samarkand now arrive in milliseconds. And the data flowing through these networks is not just commercial transactions. It is surveillance, financial records, biometric data, social media activity. The kind of information that allows a centralized authority to monitor and control populations on a scale that the Mongol Khans could never have imagined. This is not paranoia. It is documented policy. China's Belt and Road Initiative includes explicit provisions for exporting its domestic surveillance technologies, facial recognition systems, AI-powered data analysis, and social credit scoring to partner nations. And many of those nations, lacking the resources or expertise to build their own systems, are accepting these technologies as part of the infrastructure package. The Silk Road is being rebuilt. But this time, it is not just a network for moving silk and spices. It is a network for moving control. And the resources driving this new road are the same resources that drove the old one. Rare earth minerals. Afghanistan, the country that once supplied lapis lazuli to the ancient world, sits on one of the largest deposits of rare earth elements on Earth. Lithium, cobalt, neodymium, praseodymium, minerals essential for manufacturing batteries, smartphones, and the magnets used in wind turbines and electric vehicles. The estimated value of these deposits is over $1 trillion. But Afghanistan has been at war for over 40 years. The infrastructure needed to extract and process these minerals does not exist. The country is fragmented, unstable, and heavily mined. And yet, the Belt and Road Initiative includes Afghanistan as a key partner, because the resources are too valuable to ignore. This is the same logic that drove the ancient trade in lapis. A single source, a global demand, and a willingness to cross mountains, deserts, and war zones to secure access. The Chinese are not alone in recognizing this. The United States, the European Union, and Russia are all competing for influence in Central Asia, using a combination of infrastructure investment, military aid, and diplomatic pressure. And the pattern is eerily familiar. Great powers vying for control of the routes, local populations caught in the middle, and the roads themselves becoming battlegrounds. But there is something deeper happening here. Something that suggests we are not just repeating history, but fulfilling a template that was laid down long before any of these nations existed. The alignment of the Belt and Road routes with the ancient Silk Road is too precise to be purely pragmatic. Yes, the geography dictates certain paths, rivers, mountain passes, and coastal harbors have not moved, but the specific locations chosen for new infrastructure projects often correspond exactly with archaeological sites from the Bronze Age and earlier. The port at Gwadar sits near the ruins of an ancient settlement dating back to 3000 BC. The railway through the Pamir Mountains follows a route marked by cairns and stone, markers that predate the Mongols by millennia, and the new city being built in Kazakhstan as a logistics hub for the Belt and Road is located less than 50 miles from the site of ancient Otrar, a Silk Road city destroyed by Genghis Khan in 1219 but originally founded thousands of years earlier. It is as if the modern world is tracing over invisible lines, following a map that no one consciously remembers but everyone instinctively recognizes. And this raises a question that historians are reluctant to ask. What if the Silk Road was never truly ours? What if it was inherited, passed down from a civilization that walked these paths long before we did, and left behind just enough infrastructure, irrigation channels, aligned roads, sacred sites to guide every subsequent culture that rose from the ruins? The evidence we have examined tells a consistent story. The Tarim mummies, buried in 1800 BC with plaid textiles and European genetics. The irrigation systems at Nia, carved using Mesopotamian techniques that predate the symbols at Göbekli Tepe, matching symbols at sites separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The Younger Dryas impact layer, marking a moment 12,800 years ago when the world was reset and the survivors had to start over. All of it points to a single conclusion. The Silk Road is not a human invention. It is a human rediscovery. We call ourselves the builders, the innovators, the pioneers, but every road we build follows a path that was already there. Every city we construct sits on the ruins of an older one. And every technology we invent, printing, navigation, surveillance, high-speed communication is just a rediscovery of something that existed before, refined through trial and error by cultures that no longer have names. The Silk Road is a loop, a cycle that repeats every few thousand years. A civilization rises. It builds roads. It connects the world. And then, inevitably, something breaks. A plague, a climate shift, a war, and the roads fall silent, the cities empty, and the survivors, scattered and desperate, slowly begin the process of rebuilding. But they do not start from nothing. They start from the ruins, and the ruins guide them. The old irrigation channels still hold water. The old roads still follow the easiest paths through the mountains. And the old knowledge fragments of it, encoded in myth and ritual and the shapes of tools, is passed down through generations, waiting to be remembered. This is not progress. It is recursion. We are walking the same paths, making the same choices. and heading toward the same endpoints that every previous iteration reached. The only difference is scale. The Mongols connected the world with horses. We connect it with fiber optics. But the underlying pattern is identical. Build the network. Maximize efficiency. Ignore the vulnerabilities. And then watch as the network itself becomes the vector for collapse. The Black Death spread along the Yam stations. What will spread along the digital Silk Road? We do not know yet. But we will, because the pattern always completes itself. The Belt and Road Initiative is projected to be finished by 2049, 100 years from the founding of the People's Republic of China, a symbolic timeline. But if history is any guide, the network will reach peak efficiency long before then, and at that peak, something will break. A cyberratic that cascades across interconnected systems. A financial crisis that spreads through digital markets faster than regulators can respond. Or perhaps another pathogen, moving along the same trade routes that carried the plague, but this time at the speed of air travel rather than caravans. The cycle of history is repeating itself even now, and the evidence is mounting across multiple fronts. I am currently tracking new leads on the pre-glacial origins of these routes and the technologies that may have been lost in the last reset. This investigation goes deeper than anything we have covered here, so if you want to be there when the next piece of this puzzle surfaces, you need to be subscribed. But whether we are building toward progress or simply retracing the footsteps of those who came before, one thing is certain. The road itself is permanent. It exists independent of the civilizations that use it. And when our networks fail, when our cities crumble, when the next catastrophe resets the world, the road will still be there, buried under sand or overgrown with vegetation, waiting for the next culture to find it and believe, as we did, that they are the first to walk it. The Silk Road is not a path, it is a pattern. A script written into the landscape itself, followed unconsciously by every civilization that rises from the ashes of the last. We think we are choosing where to build our roads, but the roads are choosing us. And if that is true, then the question is not whether we will repeat the cycle. The question is whether we can recognize it in time to break it. The answer, inscribed in the ruins of Nia and the sealed caves of Dunhuang and the abandoned Yam stations of the steppes, is not encouraging. Every previous civilization believed it was different, that it had learned from the mistakes of the past, that its technology, its organization, its understanding of the world was superior to anything that had come before. And every one of them collapsed in the same way. By building a network so efficient, so interconnected, that a single point of failure could cascade through the entire system. We are doing it again, right now. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Internet, global supply chains that depend on just-in-time delivery, financial systems where a server failure in one country can trigger crashes on every continent. We have built a world where distance no longer protects us, where isolation is impossible, where a virus in a market in Wuhan can shut down the entire planet within 3 months, and we call this progress. But the Silk Road knows better, because the Silk Road has seen this before. It has carried the goods of empires that thought they would last forever. It has watched cities rise and fall like tides. And it has outlasted them all. Not because it is strong, but because it is patient. The road does not care who walks it. It does not care what they carry or where they think they are going. It simply waits. And when the current civilization exhausts itself, when the networks fail and the cities empty and the survivors emerge blinking into the ruins, the road will still be there, guiding them, shaping them, ensuring they build in the same places, following the same paths, making the same mistakes, because the road is not a tool we use, it is a template we follow, and we have been following it for so long that we no longer remember there was ever another way. The Silk Road never died. It simply went dormant, waiting for the next cycle, the next empire, the next group of ambitious builders who believe they can connect the world without consequence. And now, as the Belt and Road Initiative traces the ancient paths with astonishing precision, as digital networks recreate the Mongol yam at the speed of light, as the same minerals that powered ancient trade now fuel modern technology, we are waking the road again. But we are not in control. We never were. The road is awake, and it is hungry. The dust settles on the old caravanserais. The sand covers the yam stations. The silk rots in the abandoned caves. But beneath it all, the road endures, invisible, indestructible, eternal. And the question that hangs in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, is this: are we walking the road, or is the road walking us? The caravans have stopped. The horses are silent. The merchants are gone. But if you stand in the desert at dawn, when the light is low and the shadows are long, you can still see them, the paths, worn into the earth by millions of feet over thousands of years, leading east, always east, toward the rising sun, toward something that was there before we were, and will be there long after we are gone. The Silk Road is not history. It is prophecy. A map of what will happen, written by those who have already walked this path. And we, believing ourselves to be pioneers, are simply reading the script, following the lines, playing our part in a story that was finished long before we were born. The road has no end, only repetitions, and somewhere, in the silence between empires, it waits for the next beginning.